Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy my stories.
Nexara 7 is a city built in layers, a stacked anatomy of neon and rust. Marketeers hang like wounds, pedestrian tunnels crawl below and hovering platforms brood above. Flying vehicles thread the air like shoals of predatory fish, indifferent to the bodies they might shear if they fall. The smell is constant, frying spice, scorched polymer, and the metallic bite of ozone. Holographic ads puddle across walls and overhangs, painting every face in intermittent, sickly light. Micro-drones and security bots hum in constellations, their optics ticking across the crowd in a mechanical nervousness. Baparaket moves through that noise like something that has already chosen silence. He is a silhouette threaded with technology, sleeves that flatten, boots that swallow sound, a collar that refracts eyes for a heartbeat. People step aside because instinct tells them to, not because they have seen him. Traders with 6 arms continue to bargain. Insectal laborers shift crates. A gas-masked shopper coughs and coughs again. Baparaket does not look at them. He is cataloging. The weak bolt on the 3rd scaffolding rung. The vendor's stack of glass vials teetering 2 stalls down. The hover plate advertisement whose stabilizer has been chewed by storms. In the margins of his vision, the city's hazards become a ledger of instruments. The target rises above the market on a braided platform, all oil slick skin and pasted human features, a politician whose face has been retouched to be more sympathetic than his deeds. He laughs too loud. Around him, armored guards move with a choreography of menace. Chrome mercenaries with jointed plates, humanoids in reinforced carapace, hovering drones that triangulate their patrol in patient, mathematical arcs. Assistants in glossy jackets pass him biotech pouches, their hands steady only because money and fear have steadied them. The crowd flows and eddies in practiced ignorance. Baparaket studies the man like a surgeon reviews an incision. He times guard rotations, watches the tiny tick at the politician's temple when someone says the word immunity, notes the way a particular merc checks the perimeter every 43 seconds. He observes civilians too. The child with luminous eyes clasping a red plush, the vendor stacking crates by a narrow alley where the scaffolding's bolt has rusted through. All of it is data, all of it is opportunity. He releases the first instruments without a sound. Small micro-drones, flat and razor-edged, slip from the seam of his sleeve like insects spilling from a jar. They scatter in silent orbits, nearly invisible until they are necessary. A wrist blade fires with a soft, clinical whisper of old knives, an old-world sound on a new-world wrist. The first merc swallows his order and opens his throat to bark a warning. The blade finds tendon and vocal fold. The sound dies in his chest, wet and immediate. Blood, alien bright and viscous, blooms across his armor and splatters a nearby vendor tarp. The drones find joints in plating, ventilation seams in helmets, the undefended gaps between synthetic and skin. They are precise. They unfasten servos, extrude little saws, shear cables. Where plating fails, sinew and muscle pay the toll. Limbs are separated from bodies with neat, almost polite arcs. Energy blades sear through bone and cable so that robotic servos stutter as if surprised to be unmoored from their directives. Flesh and gray matter glisten. A merc's head becomes a broken thing that rolls and slaps the market tiles. Heat from the energy blades smells metallic and sweet. The politician's laugh stops when a drone punctures the pouch at his hip. He flails, a marionette with his strings hacked, and a second drone strikes the raised platform with a concussive pulse. The platform heaves. He launches into the air with the sudden, grotesque grace of a man deprived of scaffolding. The drone follows and detonates in a focused bloom that vaporizes the politician's torso into ash and steam. His face goes first, a smear of pale features in a gust of red. The hollow ads above blink static and then go dark, swallowing the last of his grin. Chaos curls outward from that first note. A hover bus misreads the sudden gap in the sky and slams into a cantilever support, folding like metal paper. Support scaffolding snaps and a row of stalls collapses. Glass vials shatter into a confetti of biotech goo and glittering polymer shards that slice into hands and throats. The child's plush sails through smoke and lands on a ruined display, a blackened foot on soft fur. Screams coalesce into an animal chorus and are picked apart by the drone hum. Baparaket does not slow. He moves with a deliberate cruelty, using the city's wounds as instruments. He hacks reaction patterns, not with subtlety but with orchestration. A hacked power conduit spits a white arc into the side of a metal scaffolding, and fleeing shoppers who grab the rail feel the current tear through wet flesh into hot bone. A dangling sign, weakened by his earlier boot kick, falls and crushes 2 guards beneath its weight, their plated plates shattering with a soothing, metallic crunch that sprays sparks and blood. A vendor's crate gives way, and a stack of polished ceramic jars slams into a merc's skull, their noses becoming red with brain and spice. He enjoys the geometry of destruction the way a composer enjoys dissonance. Each strike is placed to produce a cascade. The toppled sign severs a fuel line. Spilled fuel kisses a cigarette ember. A cluster of synth flesh wafts into flame and then collapses into ash. Civilians trip over one another in the dark of panic, stamping and trampling like animals. A hover vehicle, clipping a wayward scaffolding, loses a stabilizer and slams into a market canopy. The canopy falls like a curtain, catching the fresh and unburned hands, faces, the small red plush, and sets them screaming beneath a fog of smoke and sizzling neon. In that fog, Baparaket is hyper-accurate. He moves through customers and toppled stalls the way a predator moves through brush, scarcely disturbing the leaves but leaving proof of passage. He adjusts the drones mid-flight with tiny, surgical gestures. His wrist device fires a shaped charge that peels a merc's armor back like a can opener, exposing the soft machinery beneath. He watches reactions the way an entomologist watches insects, not with empathy but with interest. The shape of a scream, the way eyes dilate in certain species, he notes it clinically and files it away. He kills with theatrical efficiency. An assistant tries to climb down from a half-collapsed platform. His descent becomes a slow-motion lesson in gravity when a micro-drone clips the last rung. The assistant's hands find nothing but air and then a street. Limbs break in a sound like wet leather being torn. A red slick smear decorates the market tiles. A vendor tries to barricade his stall with a rusted gate. A burst of energy slices the gate like paper and opens the vendor's chest to the night. Baparaket observes the fallout. Heat waves shimmer where blood steams, and the city's neon paints everything in cruel, saturated colors. When the panic is at a sharp pitch, he pauses only long enough to collect information. A hollow briefing, delayed, encrypted, and precise, flashes at the edge of his vision. Typhon 4. Impossible to kill, it labels the new target, a challenge more than a fact. His pupils widen minutely. He closes his hand around a drone and pulls it in like a scavenger reclaiming precious metal. Then he steps away from the wreck he has authored, leaving staggered bodies and burning stalls in his wake. A grin the city will not see but which, somewhere under his skin, insists on being present. In the smoke and the stutter of cooling blades he melts back into the alleys, letting the market writhe and recompose without him. The city will remember the taste of iron and spice tomorrow. For Baparaket, memory is already moving forward. A map of Typhon 4 embroidered with possible ingress points, shield frequencies, and the kind of security that requires not patience but breathtaking brutality. He disappears into the jungle's shadowing tiers, already reworking the next act. Smoke hangs like a gray curtain over the remnants of the market, curling around twisted metal and scorched stalls. Fires flicker along the cracked tiles, sending shadows that jump across the bodies left in Baparaket's wake. The city moans with its own machinery, the hiss of overheated conduits, the groan of collapsing scaffolding, and the distant screech of panicked hovercars scraping against walls. He steps into it like a conductor entering a ruined symphony hall, every movement deliberate, every action meant to amplify the chaos around him. He reaches a junction of exposed power lines, the copper glinting beneath cracked insulation. A simple hack, a subtle pulse of energy, sends arcs dancing across the metal scaffolding where civilians had fled moments before. Screams mix with sparks as the current lances through anyone foolish enough to grab the rails or step too close. Bodies jerk, convulse, and fall. The smell of ozone and charred flesh saturates the air. Baparaket does not pause. He observes the reactions clinically, noting patterns, how different species collapse under electric shock, how some run blindly into walls or other hazards, how panic propagates like a virus through a crowd. Above him, dangling signage and partially collapsed platforms groan under their own weight. He strikes one with a wrist-mounted charge, peeling it free from its supports. Gravity does the rest. A group of mercs, already distracted by the drones and energy blades, find themselves crushed beneath a fluttering sign. Sparks and blood intermingle as fire from a ruptured fuel line ignites the wreckage, the smell of burnt flesh mingling with fried polymer. The market becomes a self-propelling cascade of carnage, each accident feeding into the next, each death a deliberate note in the symphony. He manipulates the environment like an artist manipulating paint, only his medium is destruction. Collapsing scaffolds funnel panicked civilians into the path of drones, stray sparks ignite oil slicks, overturned crates topple into guards, severing limbs or breaking armor. The drones dart like predators, finding soft spots, cutting tendons, slicing through synthetic muscle, vaporizing small targets with energy pulses. A child is knocked from a stall, rolling across tiles, only to be snagged mid-fall by a drone, which redirects him into a pile of crates that collapse instantly. Baparaket notes it as data, no remorse, no hesitation, only appreciation for the unfolding geometry of violence. As the chaos spreads, he catalogues reactions, both human and alien. Some scream, some freeze, some attempt to flee but run straight into hazards he has seeded. His psychopathy is on full display. He smiles when he observes optimal panic, the precise terror he can engineer in seconds. His mind is a ledger of suffering, a running count of bodies, injuries, and collateral destruction. Even the smallest details interest him. How a merc's energy shield deflects a drone blade just enough to glance off a nearby pole and shatter it into the path of another. How a civilian trips over rubble and inadvertently triggers another collapse. He tweaks the inputs, nudges the outputs, orchestrating carnage that looks random to anyone else. Amid the bedlam, Baparaket steps lightly across shards of glass and steaming flesh, adjusting microdrones mid-flight, ensuring their trajectories maximize casualties and structural damage. One drone arcs toward a falling billboard, slicing through rigging so it strikes two guards and pins a vendor beneath it. Another drone detonates in midair, vaporizing a hovering security bot, which in turn crashes into a group of fleeing shoppers. Fires spread in minor clusters, consuming food stalls, crates, and scraps of debris, smoke coiling like a predator stalking its own prey. Through it all, Baparaket's eyes flick from threat to threat, hazard to hazard, target to collateral, reading the market's chaos as a text he alone understands. The city itself seems to respond to him, each collapse a brushstroke on a living canvas of destruction. Pedestrians collide with one another in waves, trampling the already fallen. Hover buses miscalculate, tipping into stalls, spilling cargo and fuel. Even the overhead lights shudder as exposed conduits send sparks across platforms. Baparaket moves in the middle of it like a ghost, unseen, untouchable, fully in control. Every kill, every injury, every collapse is recorded in his mind for pattern recognition, for personal amusement, for the simple, unfiltered joy of it. He has become the pulse of the market's demise. Then the new assignment arrives. Amid the smoke and detritus, a glowing hollow orb pulses at the edge of the chaos, sharp and intrusive. Its light cuts through the smoke, illuminating shards of metal, scorched tiles, and scattered bodies. The orb rotates, projecting a secure briefing with a holographic interface that only he can access. Typhon 4, it reads. Target. Impossible to kill. Security protocols. Extreme. Prior attempts. Failures catalogued. Reward. Astronomical. The edges of the orb pulse in rhythm with the city's chaos, almost like it's trying to compete with the screams. Baparaket's pupils dilate slightly, reflecting the orb's light. He studies it with cold, methodical fascination, already tracing the orbital mechanics of the planet, the probable patrol patterns, the technological failings he can exploit. He absorbs the dossier not as a mission, but as a challenge, an invitation to escalate the artistry of death. Already, strategies form in his mind. Infiltration points, environmental manipulation, redundancy in kill methods, backup plans for contingency after contingency. The impossible becomes a canvas. Without hesitation, he steps away from the ruin he has authored. Smoke coils around him like a shroud, The fires flicker in reflection across his armor and weapons. The market is a body, and he has performed every incision and cut necessary. Bodies lie in grotesque poses. Hover vehicles are skewered, toppled, or broken. Fires creep into nearby stalls, sending embers into the breeze. The city's chaos carries on without him, but its memory is permanent. And for Baparaket, the memory is nothing. He already lives in the next act, plotting and calculating, anticipating the thrill of new blood, new destruction, and the challenge that Typhon 4 represents. As he melts into the shadows, the orb's glow fades from his peripheral vision, but the pulse of opportunity remains. He does not reflect, does not question, does not hesitate. He is the predator the city cannot see, the artist the world cannot appreciate, the psychopathy walking in plain sight. And now, with a new target, the universe has presented him the stage for his next masterpiece. The market may remember chaos, but Baparaket remembers only the calculation, the thrill, and the absolute, unapologetic dominion of his craft. Typhon 4 fell like a blade out of the void, a mega-city that had learned to stack itself into arrogance. Skyscrapers ribbed the clouds like spines, their glass skins torn and repaired so often the city looked patched with scars. Skybridges linked vertiginous towers in a web that hummed with transit. Below, the lower levels were a tangle of markets, service ducts, and machinery. Above, orbital traffic stitched the night with light. Drones in synchronized grids drifted like constellations with purpose, scanning in geometry and leaving no corner unmeasured. The city did not sleep, it curated its levels of noise and light as if those were virtues. Baparaket arrived without fanfare. He descended on a cargo spine, a maintenance tram that smelled of grease and ion coolant, blending with the workers and the hobblers who rode it, winged traders folding themselves into corners, six-armed mercenaries rubbing plated fists, and plant hybrid vendors exuding pollen that made the air drowsy. He wore a reactive cloak that drank light and a holographic mask that broke his silhouette into 100 unreadable faces. People looked at the mask and saw themselves reflected poorly, they did not look twice. He moved like someone who had practiced absence. From a skybridge that hummed with commuter traffic, he studied the city with the kind of attention reserved for surgeons and arsonists, clinical, patient, obsessed. He noted the cadence of the orbital drones, how their sweeps overlapped at 13-second intervals and how a blind band opened for exactly 9 seconds when the lower-tier orbital relay rotated. He filed the observation away. He watched the flow of traffic in the sky lanes. Commercial freighters took the low arc. Private shuttles skirted the high, enforcement sweepers held the middle. There was art in predicting motion, and Baparaket loved patterns. Down on the pedestrian terraces, neon hollow ads flashed violently, strobing faces so quickly the viewer's pupils learned to twitch. Energy weapon discharges sparked like lightning competitions in back alleys, and sirens threaded through the city like nervous birds. Market stalls sold biotech in glossy wraps, black market firmware, and spliced organ works that twitched faintly in their containers. Civilians pushed through the noise, some with augmentations that pulsed under skin, others with placid ignorance. Baparaket let his eyes move like an instrument, mapping guard positions, shield pylons, service shafts, and the brittle scaffolding of skyramps. He found the target by habit and appetite. The penthouse reared like a crown. At the top of the tallest tower, glass facades and shield pylons that pulsed in rhythmic confidence. The crime-lord politician occupied that crown, a hybrid creature with a face smoothed by expensive surgery and a posture that suggested weathered cruelty. Servitors polished his optics while chrome-clad mercenaries drifted in halos below, and automated turrets spun their bored reticles across the skyline. Above, satellites and orbital surveillance kept a patient eye. Whoever built that security grid had invested in certainty. Baparaket made himself small and invisible again and watched the attempts that had failed here before. He read the ruined reports stolen between black markets. A sniper in a high nest vaporized at range when a trace on their weapon pinged. An infiltrator who tried to lace a ventilation shaft with nanofog found the shaft sealed and the fog incinerated by an automatic filament. A cyber hack that reached an internal node was swept away as an anti-intrusion routine rerouted power and isolated the compromised hardware in microseconds. The city's defenses were not merely layered, they were adaptive, jealous, and designed to punish curiosity. He fed his micro-drones into the margins and let them hum through the building's peripheral veins. They returned with a lazy honesty of recorded things: shield pulse intervals, turret arcs, the cadence of mechanical sentries, the placement of maintenance tunnels, and the periodicity of patrol patterns on the skybridges. He discovered small weaknesses that would mean everything in aggregate: a maintenance hatch behind a billboard, a strip of reflective glass that spelled sensor confusion at dusk, a forgotten debris stack beside a service elevator that could serve as a makeshift barricade. Little things bridged big possibilities. He sat on a bench near a noodle-slung stall and watched people pass. An old woman with leafed limbs folded her hands and talked to a boy whose torso sprouted luminescent fronds. They traded a seed pouch and a joke. No one noticed the man with the chrome visor watching from 3 terraces above. Baparaket's hand brushed the hem of his cloak and his throat tasted like ice. He was aware of the children, of the vendors, of the ferry worker checking manifest. He catalogued their positions as potential variables in the equations he rehearsed. He enjoyed that practice. It made the killing clean in his head long before any blood answered the call. A hollow pulse reached him from HQ like a cold, polished insect. The briefing came as a clipped, encrypted transmission projected into his mask. A face that was not a face, voice distorted and efficient. "Agent Baparaket," the voice said. "Assessment. Typhon 4 package. Target. Seraph Voss. Tag. Unkillable. Intelligence. Multiple attempts logged within 5 years. Methods. Sniper elimination, cyber disruption, infiltration, all failed. Risk level, ultra high. Compensation, 15 million credits. Political implications, severe if target survives an assassination attempt. Dismiss caution at your discretion." Baparaket's lips twitched into something close to a smile. He slid his sleeve out and the micro-drone that had been nested there hummed, already folded on a twin axis of planning. "Ultra high, huh?" he murmured, voice unamplified. "They said the same of Nexara 7's minister and he's in ash now." The briefing voice tasted like varnish. "Agent, note. Orbital sweep windows compatible with perimeter manipulation. Shield pulse variance 32% within a 3-hour cycle. Avoid direct frontal assaults. HQ advises conservative engagement." "Conservative is dull," Baparaket said aloud, and the word hung like a promise in the air. He tapped at an interface and pulled up schematics for the crown tower. Transparent floors, false ceiling modules, maintenance rails, the building presented its skeleton obligingly. He traced turret arcs with a gloved finger, imagining trajectories and counter-trajectory, how a falling bulkhead might simulate an accident, how a reflected pulse could blind a sensor long enough to let a micro-drone through. "Confirm. No collateral exceptions?" the voice asked, formal. "Confirmed," he answered. The single syllable held no moral content. "Hostile tolerance acknowledged. Warning. Political fallout may trigger a system-wide clampdown," the voice intoned. "HQ recommends contingency exfil and minimal civilian casualties." Baparaket's laugh was small and private, an animal wheel turning. "Minimal casualties are architecturally boring," he said, "but efficient. I'll note it for the ledger." The briefing pulsed more data. Prior attack vectors, forensic analyses, even partial manifest screenshots that showed armored shipments and security contractors. Baparaket absorbed it the way a predator absorbs wind, calmly, mercilessly, with an appetite for the specific. He did not bristle at the warnings. He catalogued them and converted them into toys. Every fail in their reports was a lesson in what to do differently. Every redundancy became a vector for escalation. He noted how the orbital satellites blinked to reprocess sensor data when their cache filled, how the building's autopulse shield dropped briefly when the central cooling did a maintenance quench, perfect 6 to 8 second windows where heat signature damping skewed sensor calibration. "You'll need a plan that complicates the predictable," the voice said. "HQ is not authorizing uncontrolled destruction in populated sectors." Baparaket tapped the schematic again, tracing new possibilities. "I won't blow up a neighborhood." His voice had the casual cruelty of a man describing which toys he would pick. "But neighborhood-scale disturbance? That's a language they understand. I'll translate." Silence on the line, then, "Agent, confirmation. Do not allow target to escape. Priority, eliminate or render permanently inoperative." A flash of amusement slipped through Baparaket's features. Permanent will be a nice adjective. I appreciate the brevity. The feed closed with clinical efficiency. He swallowed the last of the transfer and let it sink into his skull the way he swallowed a suppressed breath. The city around him played its noisy life, hover buses, merchants calling ribald wares, a distant alarm resetting itself, as if nothing of consequence had passed. Baparaket rose, folded his cloak over his shoulders, and let his mask flick a dozen anonymous faces in sequence until the identity of any single one dissolved into noise. He left the public terraces with toys in his sleeve and a ledger in his mind, the seeds of methods that would make unkillable a temporary adjective. He favored options that would force the city to do the killing for him, shield manipulations that would throw sentries into confusion, reflected pulse geometry to blind orbital relays, and environmental cascades that would not just remove guards but reshape the terrain of response. He thought about mirrors and shadows, about the delicious effectiveness of a timed service quench, about how civilian panic could be directed like water through a broken dam. As he melted into the service ducts to begin his scouting, he murmured to himself, not for empathy, but to taste the next act. They think it's unkillable, he said, quiet as a closing gate. Unkillable is always temporary. And somewhere inside his head, the ledger of Typhon 4 unfurled into plans that promised not just death, but exquisite demonstration. The lower tiers of Typhon 4 felt alive in the way ruined things feel alive. A persistent, coughing thrum underfoot, a million small systems arguing with one another. Baparaket moved through them like a hand through smoke, soft and precise. He did not announce himself. His holographic mask wore an expression borrowed from a dozen faces, and his reactive cloak drank the neon so that what passed for his outline dissolved into crowd noise. He stepped beneath a skybridge and folded himself into the city's muscle. He seeded the air with instruments. Tiny nodes, nearly invisible, the size of a grain of polymer, slipped into vents, tucked under vendor mats, wedged behind speakers that spat garbled music. They hummed for an instant and began to whisper back. Pressure changes, heat signatures, the cadence of patrol boots. He watched guards from the margins, timing their walks, reading the invisible rhythm of their circuits. A maintenance shaft, unlisted on most maps and used only by crews with bad habits, became an artery he could exploit. An old service ladder the informant had named was indeed there, rusted, oiled with the wrong kind of grease, and blissfully devoid of cameras. Small things stacked into leverage. At a noodle stall that tried to look respectable, he met Jiro again. The man's enamel teeth flashed as he spoke, and the vendor's brazier smoked like a small black volcano. You wanted proof last time, Jiro murmured, glancing at the crowd like someone afraid the shadows listen. You brought more than proof, you brought weather. Baparaket's mask was a pale, neutral thing. Proof is a currency, he said. His voice was low, and the syllables slid under Jiro's skin. You delivered. I compensated. Jiro counted coins with fingers that trembled. There's a cleaner, he said. Second shift. He takes the ladder on Tuesdays when the wind's wrong. He carries a sigil that's cracked. If you slip him a burner, he can be distracted. That will do, Baparaket replied. He flicked a small device across the brazier. It detonated silently in a flare of heat that shifted a billboard's wiring. The billboard tore free, smashing into a scaffold with a sound like breaking bone. People shouted. 2 guards turned their heads. Jiro's pupils dilated in the way of people who are suddenly sure they will not starve. Double, then half, Baparaket added. Jiro scurried away with a blessing that smelled faintly of tobacco and fear. He moved like a man who liked his experiments tidy. A tipped crate here, a misrouted manifest there. Small provocations to show the city how it might betray itself. He rigged a maintenance gate to hiccup when opened and watched technicians leave their post to jab at a stubborn latch. He looped a false drone signature into a vendor's terminal and let 2 patrolling bots chase shadows for a minute longer than they should. Each small chaos carved out a window, a length of time, a direction of movement, a coordination error. He recorded response times and routes, how med bots prioritized bleeds over burns, how junior operators took the call that pulled a patrol away from a skybridge. He catalogued panic like a chess player catalogues moves. Testing required a body sometimes. He chose bodies with the kind of moral dirt he found satisfying, an inspector who greased the books, a junior tech who sold access codes. The inspector met his end in a corridor that smelled of bleach and oil. Baparaket let a measured electromagnetic pulse twitch the inspector's ocular implants into blindness. The man stumbled, palms slapping ineffective along the railing, then pitched into a maintenance cage and struck metal hard. Bone and metal met in a sound like a snapped reed, and the inspector's face folded into an expression that would never again be read. Baparaket watched the arc of that fall with an artist's calm and noted how long it took security to replace a missing pair of optics and to reroute their attention. 2 security drones answered the resulting alarm. He baited one with a microblade that chewed into its rotor housing, sending it spinning into a coolant tank. The tank ruptured, spraying a slick the color of mercury across the corridor, and the second drone misjudged the loss of lift and skittered into a vent. Sparks and smoke made the corridor forget its purpose for a moment. Civilians arrived a minute later, faces slack and frightened. A child brushed hot glass and hissed. A vendor's stall collapsed under a falling sign. He logged the collateral, lacerations, a child with a burn, a vendor's ruined week, and the way the orbital ping could be delayed by half a breath when junior operators hesitated. He did not pretend remorse for these things. They were information, and information in his hands was a weapon. When he needed spectacle, he staged it. He planted a false manifest in a vendor's terminal and lured 2 patrol drones into a plaza. A compact charge bloomed between them with a light that tasted of ozone and iron, leaving dark impressions on marble and igniting hysteria. Shoppers ran and a hover cart clipped a stall, sending groceries spraying and a child toppling. The resulting rush forced security to redistribute forces. Patrol arcs tightened and shields pulsed more often. The city answered every small insult by rearranging itself, and each rearrangement revealed a new vector. Baparaket watched with the private satisfaction of someone assembling a machine from chaos. By the time the artificial stars bled through the tower ribs, he had worked the city until it was a map of worn paths and taut nerves. The crown tower, from a distance, was all glass and pulse plates. Up close it was a skeleton of people and code. Technicians who favored the same breaks, guards who ate the same meals, orbital relays that blinked in necessary rhythms. He sat in a dim maintenance alcove and fed the data into a small projector. Shield cycles, patrol overlaps, drone latency windows played in his mosque's HUD like a beautiful, cruel lullaby. The slender windows he had found were precise, 6 to 8 second slivers where sensors lagged during the central quench, but not generous. Stealth here was a knife edge. The building's redundancies made silent removal a practice in optimism. He considered the alternatives with a mind that loved escalation like a composer loves discord. If a single clean strike would be neutralized, then noise could be the instrument. He imagined the city misreading itself. 1,000 false alarms that would choke command latencies, mirrored pulses that would blind orbital eyes for long enough. A provoked cooling quench that would eat the building's pulse and force the shields to stutter. If he could make the city's protections fold inward chasing ghosts, he could make a path. He also knew what those plans cost. Collateral would not be collateral here, it would be a lever. Panicked crowds, collapsed bridges, burning stalls, these were not afterthoughts but tools to be shaped and used. He thought about funnels. How frightened populations routed into pre-mapped corridors could be made to block reinforcements. How a cascading failure in exterior conduits could force a tower's defensive nodes to isolate themselves. That meant bodies, and he acknowledged that reality with a grin that was almost reverent. The city's screams would be a kind of music, precise and useful. At the edge of his planning, he tested a hypothesis. Set the orbital relays to scrub their caches on a predictable, quarter-hour rhythm and then force a longer scrub by creating a simulated overload. He threaded his micro-drones into a perimeter and staged a thermal spike on an exterior conduit. The tower's shields stuttered as intended. For 38 seconds, orbital feeds flashed with static and the tower's defensive AI reallocated its nodes like a man pulling blankets over a fever. It was a breath he could cut with a blade. He plotted out cascades, the timed failure of a cooling cell to force a shield quench, a reflected energy pulse to confuse a satellite array, a string of collapsed maintenance doors to funnel security into a choke point he had already marked. Each step increased the likelihood of mass panic. Each step was chosen because panic itself could be choreographed. He closed the little projector and walked back into the crowd. Around him, med teams patched the wounds from his earlier spectacles, patrols adjusted their arcs, and gossip braided into the night about a strange man who had moved like a piece of shadow. Baparaket felt no remorse and asked for none. He had moved through testing and observation into the realm of execution planning, and his mind hummed with the elaborate brutality he preferred. He had decided. Stealth was a lie on Typhon 4, and so the answer would be loud, structured, and devastating. He melted into the city's breathing mass and let the ledger in his skull reconfigure the geometry of Typhon 4 into a language of impending ruin. The crown tower's ribs glinted above like the teeth of a sleeping predator. He whispered once, almost tenderly, to the map he carried. "Unkillable isn't a sentence," he said. "It's an invitation." Baparaket perched on the edge of a rooftop high above Typhon 4, the city's veins of neon stretching into impossible verticality below him. The crown tower dominated the skyline, a jagged needle of glass and steel wrapped in energy shields that pulsed with an almost musical rhythm. He set telescopic arrays into place, each a small extension of his vision, and released camouflaged drones that glided silently through the air, slipping between antennas and hanging scaffolding like ghosts. Sensor probes clung to exposed conduits, rooftop ladders, and vent grates, their tiny hums swallowed by the city's mechanical heartbeat. The patrols moved predictably, which made them infinitely interesting. Robotic mercenaries traversed the tower's perimeters in precise loops, orbital drones swept the building's exterior with exacting regularity, and energy shields pulsed, faltering for microseconds in intervals that Baparaket logged like the turning of clock hands. Below him, the streets churned with life. Humanoid plant hybrids bartered at market stalls, hover buses swerved with mechanical grace through tight corridors, six-limbed pedestrians clustered at intersections, and winged traders swooped between balconies, their shadowed wings brushing against neon advertisements. Every movement was a variable, every collision of bodies a datum, and he catalogued each with clinical detachment. He adjusted the telescopic lens to a pair of guards on a skybridge. One slipped, caught himself with a mechanical arm, and muttered in a language that cracked and hissed. Baparaket noted it, not for amusement but for timing. Even machines made errors when confronted with imperfection. Nearby, a maintenance cable sparkled from a minor short circuit, hanging just over a pedestrian path. He stored its position, imagining the cascade it could trigger, each misstep a possible tool. Movement below shifted. Civilians carried on in predictable chaos. A child tripped over a stray hoverboard. A vendor stumbled and spilled boiling lumens into a narrow walkway. Baparaket's eyes tracked trajectories, noting who would move where and when, how panic flowed like water into predictable channels. The city was a living experiment, and he was the only one aware of the parameters he had drawn. After hours of observation, he began his small-scale tests. A single patrol drone glided along a predetermined sweep, unaware it would be caught in the trajectory of his first controlled disruption. He triggered an electromagnetic grenade, precise and silent, and the drone convulsed violently before crashing into scaffolding. The structure shuddered and fragments tumbled down, ricocheting off lower rooftops and narrowly missing a cluster of civilians. Sparks flew as exposed conduits shorted, the smell of ozone slicing through the urban air. He watched the reactions: fear, sudden confusion, instinctive attempts to escape. Two nearby civilians collided as they ducked behind a damaged advertisement holoboard. A hover bus swerved sharply, brushing a balcony before regaining course. Each reaction was logged, every human impulse filed away as if he were charting the movement of a single organism. Baparaket moved with a holographic decoy beside him, sending it along a path meant to simulate his own movement, noting how patrols responded and how the city itself bent around false cues. Unstable scaffolding became his playground. Loose cables sagged over narrow walkways, metal sheets hung like daggers, and malfunctioning power conduits spurted sparks that illuminated the alleyways below in jagged, intermittent flashes. He nudged a support beam with a micro-drone, watching it sway until it collapsed into a lower terrace. A civilian ran too close, tripping over a toppled crate, and Baparaket catalogued the panic with the detached satisfaction of someone measuring wind patterns. He directed the sparks from a conduit toward a small hovering drone. The electronics fused and the drone plummeted, crashing into a roof with a resounding metallic scream. Pedestrians scattered in all directions, alien faces twisted in terror as the first microcosms of chaos spread through the streets below. Guards reacted according to protocol, energy shields flaring and orbital drones adjusting flight paths. Baparaket's attention never wavered. Each movement, each response, was a piece of data feeding into the complex pattern he visualized for the assault he would execute. Baparaket's fascination extended beyond mechanics to psychology. He studied screams as if they were musical notes, the way alien physiology reacted to sudden death or chaos. A human-like hybrid stumbled, tripping over a loose cable, shrieking as sparks licked the air around them. A winged trader's cry rose above the market. Noise as they flailed for safety. He noted fight-or-flight responses, the split-second decision-making of both guards and civilians, imagining how these reactions could be manipulated en masse. The city became a living experiment of terror, and he conducted it with the precision of a maestro and the indifference of a god. At night, he synthesized everything he had observed. The building's pulse, guard rotations, drone sweep intervals, shield cycles, maintenance shaft positions, and civilian patterns were all overlaid in his mind. He ran simulations, folding failures and deviations into new trajectories of destruction. Stealth, he realized, was a myth here. The defenses were too complex, the redundancies too tight. The clean, surgical strike he preferred was impossible. Instead, he turned to scale, planning environmental manipulation that would ripple through the tower like a virus, collapsing scaffolds, redirecting power surges, triggering chain reactions in drones and conduits alike. He imagined funnels of panicked civilians, perfectly placed obstacles to redirect both foot traffic and security forces into predictable channels. He visualized energy pulses blinding sensors, small explosions staged to mimic accidents, all feeding the ultimate goal, a total, uncontainable chaos that would allow him to reach the target. Collateral was no longer an inconvenience, it was an amplifier. The more the city screamed, the more leverage he would have over every human, hybrid, and machine that could interfere. Baparaket's lips curved into the faintest smile, an expression more predator than man. He slipped back into the crowded streets, letting the night swallow him, already iterating on multiple attack sequences in his mind. Each movement was calculated, each window of opportunity, precise. He knew every trajectory, every reaction, every variable he could influence. Typhon 4 was alive, and he would compose its death with the artistry of pure calculation. Unkillable, he whispered to himself, fingers brushing the edge of a microprobe. They call it impossible. I call it an invitation. He stayed above the city until the horizon turned the color of copper and the ribbed towers sighed as they shifted into night mode, their shields pulsing like the slow breath of some sleeping leviathan. From that height the world looked tidy, lines and arcs and light, but Baparaket knew how quickly neat things unraveled when pressure was applied at the right angle. He tightened the array of sensors around him like a crown, each instrument a small, heartless oracle. He let the data flow, guard cadence, shield decay curves, drone latency, the little rhythms people kept that they thought were private. He fed every anomaly into the ledger in his head and then ran each one through 1,000 possible distortions. He spent long minutes watching fear as if it were a physical force. When the scaffolding he'd nudged days before finally buckled under a marginal load, a cluster of commuters below were knocked off balance and their bodies collided with the predictable, horrific poetry of mass panic. One fell against a vendor's burner. The flesh sizzled, and for a second the smell of burning meat and polymer mixed like a bad cologne. Baparaket logged not the smell but the timing. How long it took for someone to lift the first hand to the face, how fast a crowd turned, how quickly a leader emerged to pry people from the jam. Panic has leaders. Panic has routes and eddies. He could count on them. He amplified his experiments. A maintenance cable, already frayed by weather, received a tiny charge that made it snap at a specific psychophysical frequency. The vibration cut a support cable loose and a cascade tumbled, sending a slab of composite clattering down to a lower terrace and shattering into jagged, surgical pieces. A patrol caravan was nearby. Parts of the slab sheared through a merc's knee and the servo in it gave a wet, mechanical cough before the limb collapsed into uselessness. The merc's face convulsed in that half-human, half-machine way as pain met malfunction and the guards stared at his ruined joint with a kind of professional horror. Civilians screamed. Someone vomited. For Baparaket the spectacle was a lesson. How quickly trained muscle becomes frantic animal when the mechanics fail. He tested the city's reflexes until the reflexes began to lean on habit. He used holographic decoys to simulate extraneous movement and observed how the patrols redistributed. He seeded a vendor's terminal with a ghost manifest and watched 2 drones peel away, their flight paths leaving the tower's north corridor temporarily thin. Then he timed how long the orbital sweep took to notice the discrepancy and how many seconds it spent reclassifying the signal. The window was always smaller than the city promised. The administrators had bought redundancy with gilded credits. But redundancy meant more targets for manipulation. If one controller blocked a hole, another would route around it like a river seeking a new channel. Baparaket found the channels and made plans to dam them. When he needed to shape a reaction rather than merely observe it, he arranged bodies into the experiment. Not always living ones, often the industry-produced corpses that did the work for him. A broken courier whose hover sled had its stabilizer cut by a passing drone, or a pack of malformed livestock animals spooked into a barricading stampede. But sometimes a living body was the most instructive tool. He recruited, bribed, and then quietly removed the small men who thought they could sell him secrets for a handful of credits. An inspector who took bribes for certification papers found his elevator car's emergency brake fail mid-ride. The car dropped 2 floors and his skull met metal in a wet, private punctuation. Baparaket watched the arc of the body as it fell, then the way the med bots arrived and the security logs were rewritten by hands that liked to tidy messy things. He watched, too, how grief and shock altered a city's readiness. After a public collapse where 2 traitors were embedded beneath a buckled frame, more people kept their heads down. Shops closed earlier than usual. An unspoken caution permeated the streets like a new kind of weather. That slight diminution in movement was currency. Fewer people on certain skybridges meant less interference for an infiltration. More clear paths created predictable clusters where people fled toward the same exits. He thought like a hydraulics engineer. Change the tides and the pressure points shift. Fear would make the city pour itself into channels he could anticipate and exploit. He refined lethality, not out of cruelty for its own sake but because precision demanded testing. One drone cut a maintenance cable too close to a fuel transfer line and ignited a pocket of gas. The resulting flame threw tendrils that licked at the nearby hover lane, causing a shuttle to jettison passengers into the night like a ruptured womb expelling its contents. The sound of bodies hitting composite panels below was a raw percussion to which Baparaket listened carefully. He measured the lag between impact and the next patrol wave, he measured the time med bots took to prioritize rescue over containment, and he measured the way newsfeed's algorithms amplified the footage into hysteria. That hysteria would be the raw material for the plan, a boil to be lanced at the right moment. He began to choreograph the dominoes that would break the tower's ecosystem. If the orbital relays blinked to clear their cache when their temperature thresholds rose, he would raise those thresholds. He understood the architecture of thermals in the tower's cooling conduits. He could stimulate a quench in precisely chosen modules to force a shield downtick. If the shields hiccuped for even the slenderest of rhythmic breaths, an ingress could be forced. He catalogued which conduits, when overloaded, caused sensor recalibrations and which made the central AI divert cycles into mundane tasks. It was the difference between asking a door to open and blowing the hinges off. HQ spoke in sanitized warnings via encrypted feeds. Agent, you're encroaching acceptable risk. Minimize civilian casualties. The voice was bureaucratic and measured, like a surgeon asking a butcher to reduce splatter. Baparaket answered with the soft amusement of someone who'd memorized the sound of fear and found his sense of humor in it. Acceptable is a subjective word. History favors the loud acts. Political fallout will be severe, the feed warned. Consider non-escalatory alternatives. He smiled without irony. Non-escalatory alternatives are for people who like to be remembered for being reasonable. He turned the conversation into numbers, into angles, into the elegant geometry of ruin. The tower's defense had blind spots not because of neglect but by necessity. The systems had to trust something, and that trust always fell into predictable human habits. Shift changes, favorite snack times, the trash collector who liked to whistle at noon. Each was a notch on the lever he planned to pull. He catalogued names and faces, times and rituals, and built a timetable in his mind like a clockmaker assembling springs. By watching fear up close, he learned its physiology across species. Some aliens vocalized in high, flute-like tones that ricocheted and attracted predation. Those sounds sent crowds running toward enclosed spaces. Others went rigid, their muscles locking like over-tightened cables, and when they froze they became obstacles the panicked could trip over. He adapted his traps to those responses, mapping reaction trees. Cry leads to collapse, collapse leads to funneling, funneling leads to exposure. He would not only use fear, he would engineer the route fear took. He tested contingencies. If the shields dropped for 8 seconds, what was the maximum throughput of a drone swarm? If the south stairwell was jammed, how many bodies could accumulate and in what posture? If a heat quench made the central AI temporarily prioritize heat mitigation, how long would it suspend perimeter checks? He mapped these questions with the cold thrill of someone solving a puzzle where every solved edge promised a bloom of red. His plans were not mere violence, they were systems engineering applied to slaughter. In quieter moments he let his thoughts move beyond empirical application and into narrative. He imagined the tower shuddering as if in pain, turrets swinging and arresting mid-scan, feeds flickering with static and then returning to reveal half-formed scenes of chaos, armored men groping for purchase on slick steel while civilians fell like leaves. The image thrilled him in the way that a sculptor might thrill to a block of marble about to be transformed. He saw the target, Serif Voss, not as a single body but as an idea, a note of arrogance to be consumed by the city he had taught to betray itself. He gathered the final pieces of his plan like a collector gathering rare talismans. A few high-yield shaped charges hidden in the right conduits to start a thermal cascade. A packet of reflective film to blind a particular satellite array by angling a billboard. A string of micro-drones programmed with false telemetry to make the orbital sweeps chase ghosts. A selection of corrupted manifests seeded into vendor networks to pull patrols out of place. Each piece by itself was a whisper. Together, they would be a scream. When he finally stepped down from the rooftop, the tower's lights glinted coldly in the distance like the eyes of a predator. He walked through the streets with the same ease as before, but his ledger was full now, not with hope or doubt, but with precise, terrible intent. The decision had settled into his bones. Stealth was impossible and patience would only delay a different kind of inevitability. The work ahead required scale and spectacle and a willingness to let the city do some of the killing on his behalf. As he crossed a narrow skybridge, a vendor's child reached for a dropped trinket and nearly toppled over the edge. Baparaket glanced down, saw the small hands fumble and the fear flare in the child's eyes, and felt something that might have been akin to tenderness, a fleeting curiosity at the texture of that fear, before he turned away. He did not intervene. The child righted himself, sobbing, and a passing guard steadied him with a grunt. The act was small and irrelevant, but it reminded Baparaket that control was always a negotiation between what one could do and what one decided to do. He had decided. The ledger closed like a book. He would not attempt a clean strike. He would clear the way with engineered chaos, with mirrored pulses and collapsing scaffolds and panic-driven bottlenecks, and then he would step through the gap the city made for him. The plan was brutal and large and precise, and in that precision he tasted the anticipation of a work finished. He disappeared into Typhon 4's vertical night with the same patient cruelty he had always shown, not a rush but a long, steady hunger. The city kept breathing around him, unaware that someone had already begun composing its dirge. Night knifed down on Typhon 4 and turned the tower glass into a bleeding field of light. Baparaket slid through the city's underbelly with the surety of someone who knew the difference between luck and competence. Service ducts smelled like old coolant and iron. The concrete walls bore damp handprints and graffiti stamped with 10 different languages. He moved with skin-sheer cloaking hugging his body, a shadow that listened. Micro-motes clung to his sleeves and folded into vents like obedient insects. He breathed slow, mechanically measured breaths and hummed under his teeth a tune that meant nothing to anyone else. The maintenance corridors were a spiderweb of forgotten access points. Pipes looped in earnest, valves winked with oily residue, and the seams were studded with patched welds that would not hold an argument. He deployed telescopic motes into junctions and watched their scans bloom across his HUD. Power grids, shield synchronizers, elevator control matrices, life support subroutines, an architecture of faith and hidden failure. He mapped the core's heartbeat down to the second, cooling cycles, shield node refresh rates, the micro-lag and elevator controller introduced when it handed off to a redundant motor. That lag was his favorite thing that night. A patrol moved 2 corridors over. The guards down here believed in their protocols like prayer. They were minimal, complacent, the kind of men who treated maintenance as boredom rather than possibility. Baparaket watched one of them laugh at a joke halfway through his beat. The sound irritated him a little, the way a fly irritates in a quiet room. He stepped into the dim and the man's spine took the job of death with a clean, clinical interruption. A ceramic micro bolt into an actuator, a servo seized, a body crumpled into a coil around a conduit. The guard's helmet hit a pipe with a snapped, wet sound and his eyes went flat. Baparaket adjusted a mote's position and kept walking. The body would be found later, catalogued by someone with better paperwork than grief. He preferred such small, private murders when he had the time. A petty insult, a cocky grin, a vendor who'd tried to overcharge him, those were invitations. He stopped a vendor who hawked bootleg nano sweets and told him to lower the price in a voice that sounded like someone discussing weather. The man argued, bold, necessary. Baparaket's fingers found the vendor's throat like a thought and closed it. By the time anyone noticed, the vendor's face slackened and his goods tumbled into the gutter. Baparaket had folded a mote into the vendor's apron and moved on. He catalogued the tiny thrill and stored it as one more variable. How long it took for a merchant's stall to be looted after a quiet death, how quickly gossip propagated. He found the service vault under 2 floors of municipal detritus. It smelled of rust and old promises. The locker that held the black market cash had been cleaned poorly. Someone had been too thorough leaving evidence. Fusion charges lay under municipal paperbacks and obsolete civic manuals. A compact reactor core blinked in unhappy red. He worked in a semi-religious quiet, fingers moving with practiced disrespect. Wiring was rerouted like the veins of a body being rearranged to make a machine more obedient. Dampeners were fitted, heat sinks grafted. He wrote a fusing algorithm that ticked like a private clock and uploaded a failsafe that would trigger whether the device was engaged remotely or if the network tried to neuter it. He smiled when the core hummed a different note, a clean, cruel harmony. When he dressed the device, he made it look municipal. A maintenance subroutine module, a thing that would calm sensors rather than alarm them. To the eye of a camera it was banal. To the motes woven into it, it was a heartbeat with an opinion. He folded his micro-motes into its casing and watched their tiny processors act as authentication tokens. A maintenance drone, the kind of dumb, efficient thing that liked routine, would see the device and chalk it up to civic care. He coded the drone's call sign into the network and watched its path reroute to deliver his false package into a pressurized access bay on the reactor spine. Before the package was placed, he softened the sensors. Resonant frequency emitters made motion sensors hum like tired refrigerators. Synthetic fingerprints. Harvested from a technician who had once been too arrogant to change his gloves. Unlatched biometric locks and the access bay opened with a polite mechanical sigh. Baparaket moved like a surgeon with a soft brutality. He placed the dressed module into the bay and slid a last mote into a maintenance tongue plate. Cameras logged an act of maintenance and sent neat packets to archives that would later become forms of evidence irrelevant to him. He liked theater, not simple boom and collapse, but orchestration. He threaded the building's veins with small lies. He hacked sprinkler hydraulics so certain sectors would flood while others dried. He reversed pressures in select gas lines so a breach would push fuel into load-bearing ducts. He nudged transport lane timing so an empty freight cage would barge into a commuter carriage at the precise second choreographed to instill maximum panic. Each small change had a purpose: funnel, confuse, stall. He uploaded an emergency directive into the tower's public address system, a voice not unlike the building's own, and instructed it to evacuate toward the north concourse. He had sabotaged the north exits. Panic would obediently walk to the trap. As he tuned the microcontroller into the architecture of orbital blind cycles, his mind amused itself with petty cruelties. A security tech who had been a first-shift braggart and who bragged loudly in a commissary earlier that week got his moment. The man's grin had irritated Baparaket. The man would be useful as an example. He rerouted a maintenance ladder the man favored and planted a micro shear on the upper rung. When the bragging tech ascended to fetch an instrument, the ladder gave under him and he plummeted into a maintenance shaft with a final, surprised animal sound. Baparaket watched the spill via a moat camera feed and noted how long it took for the med bots to prioritize the fallen over active structural failures. It was a lesson in triage and human calculation. Not all the kills were strategic, many were small, selfish, random. A janitor who hummed the same tune in the corridor. A contractor whose breath smelled of cheap liquor and gossip. The randomness of removal held its own beauty. He murdered a man who whistled unabashedly at a group of women leaving their shift and called it a correction. He slit throats the way others trimmed hedges. Some losses registered as numbers in his ledger, some as textures. The particular way blood smoked on a fluorescent tile. The way a body's eyes slackened, the faint, indignant whimpers of someone who had not yet had time to curse. Between the private acts of cruelty he attended to the engineering of mass failure. He pushed the tower's shield synchronizers into a small oscillation and watched the nodes twitch. He found the exact thermal conduit that, if confronted with a small enough, repeated stimulus, would cause the central cooling logic to prioritize heat mitigation and pull cycles away from perimeter checks. He wrote a module to provoke that stimulus in sequence, a rhythm that would make the AI shift focus like a beast chasing a phantom. He seeded reflective film in an unnoticed billboard and angled it to blind a particular orbital node at dusk. He knew, from careful observation, the exact second that node reprocessed its cache and where its latency lived. He staged a phantom manifest at a market vendor to pull patrol drones into a long chase of ghosts. He set a string of minor fires in a service shed to make med bots route to burns instead of structural integrity. Every action multiplied the city's confusion. He embroidered the small acts so the big one would look inevitable. HQ pinged him, their graceless tone a wet admonition across the feed. Agent, status, confirm no mass casualty, standing orders. He let the message sit in his ear with amused patience. Understood, he said softly. I am preserving civility. They did not like his civility. We're ordering restraint, the feed snapped. Containment protocol remains in effect. Containment was an idea for people who liked tidy things. Baparaket's smile was a ghost that passed across his jaw. Containment is boring, he replied. I'll note it in the ledger. He worked the ledger like a lover. The precise number of seconds a particular med bot took to reallocate its attention when confronted with simultaneous burn and crush injuries. The number of civilians who would run to the North Concourse when told to evacuate. The fraction of orbital nodes that would suffer reflective interference when the billboard film angled at 37 degrees. He catalogued them with clinical hunger and tested contingencies. If a shield node failed entirely, how quickly would redundancy reroute? If a bridge snapped, what flow would people choose? If the North Concourse jammed, would the evacuation flow split into two predictable funnels? On a supply stair he found a courier with a mouth too full of bravado and promises. The man's laugh grated. Baparaket's fingers closed around the man's throat like a closing argument. He left the courier hanging and still, watching the slack of a man who had scorned him earlier as the life left the body, and he felt nothing but the tidy pleasure of an annoyance corrected. He turned away without looking back. When everything was in place he checked the microcontroller's synchrony one last time. Orbital sweep lull, confirmed. Shield capacitor dip, confirmed. Maintenance drone delivery, recorded as completed. The countdown interface blinked in his HUD, a metronome of the inevitable. He listened as the building below breathed and the city above slept, ignorant, and for once he allowed himself a private, small laugh at the arrogance of institutions that trusted code more than fate. The window he had carved was narrow but pure. He exhaled and let the motes recenter. He tuned his suit's cloak for a long drift and moved back into the ducts to watch the final seconds before the world he'd rewritten took its first new breath. The countdown began to whisper through the device's channel, the numbers steady and obscene in their simplicity. He thumbed open a comm line and let HQ's last professional protest wash over him like static. Proceed, he mouthed to no one and everything, as if the building itself were an audience. The light on his HUD slid from orange to red and the ledger in his head flipped like a page. He stowed his petty satisfaction and allowed the machine he'd crafted to sing. He did not press the button with a final flourish. He let the clock do its work and watched the city answer itself, knowing the second the first cascade would fall. The moment was a suspension, the hush before an orchestra that had been tuned to become a riot of fire. He stayed in the ducts, quiet as wrought, listening to the city shift into the posture he'd engineered, cataloging every breath for later. The blast tore the night into two distinct memories, before and after. One moment the tower was a crown of glass and humming shields. The next it vomited a yellow-white bloom so hot and sudden it seared the retinas of distant observation nodes. For an instant the city was reduced to a single sensory artifact, light so bright it rewired perception, then a pressure wave that arrived like a physical animal, pushing air, bodies, and debris in a blind, violent breath. Baparaket watched through feeds and through vents. The camera closest to the core fried into a smear of pixels, then spasmed back with a charred, half-formed image that looked like a face turned inside out. The surrounding glass vaporized and steel skeletons melted into molten lines that fell and hissed on impact. A hover transport that had been cutting across the upper levels simply ceased to be. Its passengers were translated into a second of flame and then absence. The sound was wrong in the feeds, not a sound so much as a pressure that arrived late and ugly and left a silence full of pain. Where the blast did not instantly incinerate, it left the city in a brazen new geography. Walls peeled outward, seams splayed like torn skin, and molten residues that rained like a meteor shower onto streets and plazas. Cars and hover vans were tossed like toys. Skybridges snapped and flailed. Fires ignited in a million niches, and the acrid, complex smell of burnt organics and synthetic materials braided together into a new perfume for the city. In the plazas, people who had not been turned to ash ran or stumbled, their clothing smoked and hair singed, skin reddened and blistering. Some clung to one another, others dragged the living from the dying. The human geometry of the city was rearranged instantly into tableaus of agony. Baparaket did not move to gloat, he moved to catalog. He had a professional's hunger for details. The way certain metals vaporized before others, the precise interval between the pulse and the orbital feed blackout, how long it took for the automated med bots to attempt triage in a zone where their sensors were still functional. He annotated each frame with a quick, clinical notation and stored them. The aesthetic of collapse was instruction, and he drank instruction like a man thirsty for mastery. HQ detonated on his comlink like a struck hive. Hollow faces appeared, pale, almost translucent under panic light, their voices pitching and repitching as they tried to summon authority from the chaos. Agent Baparaket, an officer barked. Report. Explain. Who authorized? Baparaket toggled the incoming feed so that it layered with the live visuals of a skybridge falling. He let the hollow face watch a line of bodies tumble into a pool of molten glass. It was authorized by the mission, he said, corporate calm like oil on a fire. Result. Achieved. You have incinerated a city block. There are thousands of civilian casualties. You have violated protocol. The voice tried for outrage but frayed into pleading. Do you understand the political ramifications? He snorted softly, a sound that might have been amusement if anyone in the hollow could read it. Political ramification. Reordering. It will concentrate resources, people, and, frankly, attention. Consider it effective. Silence filled their side for a breath, then a keening of bureaucratic fury. Headquarters is convening emergency council. You will be debriefed. You will be held accountable. That will be difficult, he said. I will be in a different jurisdiction. Their faces flashed, the hollow frames manic in indignation. You are not above command, agent. You are not. He cut them off with a soft click. I never claimed to be above anything, he said. Only that I work more efficiently without excessive caution. He left them sputtering. Beyond the feed, the city continued to burn. Looters, the ugly opportunists of catastrophe, spilled from side streets. They moved like packs, eyes glittering in smoke, drags of stolen goods and looted tech slung over shoulders. Baparaket brushed past a cluster of them in a maintenance tunnel, smelling their cheap tobacco and the hot sweat of adrenaline. One looter grinned at him with a mouth full of gold teeth and said, "You see that? Someone made it rain." Baparaket only inclined his head. He felt nothing for their delight. They were scenery, raw material for the story he had started. Rescue squads arrived with mechanical efficiency. Drones with IR sweeps trawled the perimeter, dropping med units that opened like mechanical flowers to tend to burns and crush injuries. Their routines were halting at first, sensors confused by the electromagnetic wash, then more coordinated as adaptive protocols routed around dead nodes. The med bots triaged, amputated where necessary, and shuttled the worst cases to emergency barges on the river, their hulls plastered with emergency insignia and the faces of volunteers screaming into static-laced comms. Amid the heat and smoke, human moments proliferated in 1,000 different ways. A woman held a child whose skin had been blistered into rawness and whispered nonsense and prayers. 2 men argued over a mechanical arm they'd found in a pile of rubble, whether to sell it or try to reattach it to a vendor downriver. A prayer group formed around a burned statue that had once been the city's patron icon. Their small rituals were improvisations against the arbitrary arithmetic of death. Political reaction was immediate and brutal. Trade lanes closed. Diplomatic pings became a storm of demands and accusations. Nearby planetary governors denounced the attack as terrorism and called for reprisals. The market in the central dome dropped as transport contracts were frozen and insurers hedged their bets. ATC corridors choked with idle freighters awaiting clearance, and the orbital lanes that once turned neon ribbons were now policed by enforcement corvettes glinting coldly, their captains barking unreadable orders into the dark. HQ's fury shifted from administrative outrage to strategic panic. They sent hunters, not just words but assets, elite teams, sanctioned assassins, orbital trackers armed with authorization to pursue. They blamed intelligence failures and, more dangerously in their eyes, bad actors inside the ranks. They demanded names, breadcrumbs, signatures. Baparaket had left an arrogant hyperlink embedded in a maintenance manifest, a fake logger line that read like a taunt if you read the metadata. They pounced on the breadcrumb like dogs on a bone, enraged and proud to be incensed. In the ruined streets, the ecology of survival reorganized. Scavengers picked through the edges of the blast radius with clinical care. A small woman with a heavy pack moved like a shadow along a wall, extracting a child's charred toy and placing it in a satchel as if it were currency. Nearby, a group of security contractors, survivors, dazed and enraged, set up a crude cordon to control traffic, extorting passage fees from skittish refugees. The city's new market was barter and threat, fuel for food, med pills for information. Baparaket watched and documented, but the compulsion to insert himself into the living tapestry pulled at him. He slipped through ruined metro tubes that had turned into rivers of steam and neon, moving with a practiced stealth despite the open catastrophe. People gave him space because their bodies were occupied with grief and fear and because his mask showed a dozen anonymous faces at once. He found, opportunistically, a man who had been climbing through a scorched tuk-tuk and who muttered about the cost of living and the insult of hunger. The man's voice was sharp and brash, it grated. Baparaket's hand was quicker than pity. A ceramic spike slipped into the man's neck and in a matter of seconds the conversation ended. He left the body slumped against a rusted railing. Scavengers later took the jacket and left the bones. He did not tally that man in any ledger for public display. He did not need to. But privately, when he closed the comms and watched a burnt skyline bloom into stars of fire, he added names to his internal map. Trivial names, petty reasons, a list that fed the shape of his satisfaction. These random slayings were not dramatic, they were small, meant only to remind himself that agency existed at every scale. A life erased for no reason but annoyance confirmed a principle. If the universe distracted him, he could answer. The uncertainty about the penthouse target, the corrupted biometric readouts, the smeared evidence in fried cameras, gnawed at the corporate part of his brain that loved closure. HQ's technicians clawed at the data wreckage and found, in the chart wake, only ambiguous signatures. "We have no positive ID," one of their analysts said over a compressed channel, voice flat with the kind of stress that wears at the eyes. "It's a mess. We can't confirm boss." He watched that failure with an almost tender, polite vexation. He had expected some ambiguity, he had not expected it to be satisfying to any degree. But the lack of confirmation did not unmake the act. If anything, it smeared HQ's certainty and made them an animal of reaction, which he liked. Their pursuit would become personal. They would send hunters smelling of their own outrage. They would break protocols and make mistakes. as he moved beyond the city into subterranean channels that smelled like melted plastic and the sweet rot of scorched vegetation. He considered the political fallout with the cold curiosity of a chess player watching pieces scatter. Trade deals would be delayed. Local power brokers would lose leverage. Elections would be postponed or accelerated depending on who had the courage or the cruelty to ride the wave he'd made. Factions would form. Opportunists who praised him as a purifier, bureaucrats who craved his scalp as an offering to stability. He catalogued each potential reaction with thin amusement. At a river pier outside the city, he finally stopped. The skyline was a serrated bruise against the horizon, intermittent fires punctuating the silhouette. Typhon 4's neon had become embers that winked and died. He took in the ruined vista the way a sommelier tastes wine, long, quietly, appreciating notes of ash and copper and the animality of smoke. He let the hunger in his chest settle into a cold, satisfied coil. A single message from HQ lit his HUD. The words were short and formal, the kind of bureaucratic acid that demanded accountability. Kill order. Contain and terminate. Acid. Baparaket. He allowed himself a small grin. It was exactly what might be expected. They would chase him. They would try to make him legible. The hunt would be a salve for their panic. He liked the idea of being chased. It would make them bolder, making more mistakes for him to exploit. He closed the message and cast his gaze over the dying city once more. For Baparaket, the destruction was both instrument and art. For those left behind, it was loss writ so wide it would rewrite the political geography of their world. He rose, shoulders loose, and stepped away from the river, moving already into new plans, not retreat, not remorse, but escalation. The game had begun in earnest. The orbital ring of Erythra stretched endlessly above the crimson swirls of Typhon 4's ruined atmosphere, a steel and glass skeleton threading low orbit like a predatory halo. Baparaket arrived as if he owned the corridors, his boots making no sound on the polished titanium plates, the hum of distant engines reverberating through the ribbed halls. Ozone and the bitter tang of recycled coffee mingled in the air, but he inhaled it like perfume, savoring the artificiality of life in orbit. Staff glanced at him, some with the pale prickle of fear, others with the curiosity of minor animals glimpsing a lion in a cage. He let them wonder while passing by, his gait casual, deliberate, like a man rehearsing the indifference of the universe itself. Scanners ticked and blinked as he moved through security with an arrogance that grated at officers. Biometric signatures were masked, manifest data baked into maintenance logs, and nothing in the system protested. A junior officer muttered under her breath as she passed him, "He's here again, after everything." Baparaket's ear caught the words. A subtle smile curled at his lips. He lingered long enough to see the boy step into a corridor and trip over his own sleeve, tumbling headfirst into a maintenance crate. Baparaket's motion was graceful as he extended a hand, but not to help. A single flick of his wrist sent a concealed ceramic dart into the boy's neck. The officer's scream died in the corridor as he fell neatly, unnoticed by any eyes but the assassins. He tucked the body behind an air vent, adjusted his cloak, and continued. Another tally in the ledger, added casually, annoyance corrected. The observation bays above offered a view down at the planet's ruin, glowing fires, twisted metal, and the lingering smoke of chaos he had authored. Counselors in soft uniforms sipped synthetic wine, muttering about sanctions and ruined markets. Baparaket inhaled the complacency around him like a drug, tasting the fear that simmered just beneath polite smiles. One middle-aged analyst, so distracted by holoscreens that he did not notice the assassin's shadow cross behind him, was jabbing at a keyboard with a finger too eager. Baparaket's hand snapped forward, and a microbolt ended the analyst's work, embedding neatly in his skull. The body slumped, hair and shoulder brushing wires, a perfect alignment with his internal aesthetic. He noted the reaction of the passing intern, a sharp intake of breath, eyes widening. Another kill, another ripple in the orchestra he conducted invisibly. Through the polished corridors, the assassin moved like a whisper of malice. He stepped lightly past a pair of security bots who rotated lazily, adjusting a minor setting on their interface just to watch them spark and seize when a moded pulse coursed through their circuits. A cleaning droid, humming incessantly about dust quotas, drew his attention next. Its chirruping was an irritation, an affront to his patience. He reached into the open panel and sent its micro-actuators into chaos. It exploded into a spray of wires and sparks, leaving a hole in the hallway where children of mechanics might have passed. For Baparaket, the lesson was dual, amusement and environment manipulation. He allowed himself a rare chuckle when he entered the debrief chamber. The senior counsel was waiting, faces cold and calculated, projected in hollow against a tapestry of stars and the ruins below. Directors in expensive cuts, a security chief with cybernetic optics that tracked everything, a political liaison taut with terror. Baparaket catalogued them all while planting the smallest seeds of panic. He let a micro-mote drift past the liaison's chair, unnoticed, recording pulse patterns, micro-movements, even the smallest inhalation variations. The council began their accusations, sharp as knives. You've broken every protocol. Civilian casualties, unacceptable. You've destabilized planetary politics, explosive disregard. Baparaket did not flinch. I ensured the target had no options, he said, his voice soft but slicing. Collateral damage? Perhaps, but strategic leverage is rarely neat. He allowed a pause, eyes scanning the room. Your factions now scramble. Orders are obeyed or ignored. You call that chaos. I call it efficiency. The liaison leaned forward, trembling. We cannot allow this. It must be contained, clarified, reversed. Baparaket's gaze shifted to the woman's exposed wrist. Tiny, careless, he pressed a hidden release in his sleeve. A micro-dart launched silently and embedded beneath her cuff. She jerked once, eyes wide, and collapsed as if exhausted by her own terror. The council froze. Baparaket straightened, noting the rhythm of panic and disorder. Another small, random kill, purely out of irritation at her trembling hubris. The security chief's eyes glinted as he moved closer. Explain your actions, he demanded. The assassin leaned back, unbothered. I've already done so, he said smoothly. Then, his attention shifted to a hovering assistant scanning a hollow table, nervously tapping keys. One dart later, and the assistant fell limp, still typing as his fingers curled around non-existent letters. Baparaket observed the effect clinically, nodding to himself as the hollow readouts flickered. Forensics and evidence simulations began their dance. Data streams glitched under electromagnetic wash and residual heat. Massive destruction made body recovery impossible. Yet, he could not resist adding a few signature touches. A maintenance courier who had been walking past a window too casually was nudged by a micro-drone, sending him toppling into a stairwell at terminal velocity. Sparks from exposed conduits hit the polished floor and left the body outlined in a stark silhouette. Another anonymous note. Annoyance corrected, experiment recorded. The liaison demanded biometric confirmation. There must be proof, she shrieked. Baparaket allowed a mode to flick past, corrupting the signal feed so that her voice and image would loop in slight delay. Proof, he muttered softly, is overrated. Outside, the station buzzed with political frenzy. Ambassadors shouting at hollow consoles, trade ministers banging desks, corporate overlords juggling datapads and threats. Baparaket observed the chaos as if conducting it, small dashes of violence and terror peppered throughout. A bored junior analyst he passed in the corridor caught his gaze, made the mistake of laughing nervously. His hand flicked. The analyst's neck snapped with minimal force, and he was folded neatly into a corner, another lesson in discretion and efficiency. He left crumbs, too. Planted leaks in the network, false comms, manipulated feedboards, all to deepen confusion. The more they scrambled, the more he smiled, noting reactions, testing patience, cataloging panic like an art form. Each small death, each minor correction, was both entertainment and data collection. The political fallout, the frantic counsel, the scattered evidence, it all obeyed his choreography, though to everyone else it seemed pure catastrophe. By the time he stepped back into the corridor leading away from the debrief chamber, the ledger in his mind had grown heavy. 12 bodies that were not required for strategy, only for irritation or amusement. Dozens more indirectly affected by micromanipulations. He inhaled the recycled air, tasted ozone, and felt the thrill of control without a single observer fully aware. Typhon Force fires flickered below as a reminder of what he could do. Erythra's orbital station buzzed with the tension he had sown, ripe for harvest. He moved on, counting and smiling quietly, already anticipating the next act. Baparaket moved through the orbital station's corridors like a predator exploring its domain. The lights above reflected off his hollow mask, painting his angular features in fractured neon. Every corridor, every maintenance hatch, every shadowed junction was already mapped in his mind, catalogued with potential for opportunity or death. The security chief's quiet warning had been noted but dismissed. Names, faces, habits, they were all variables now, potential fodder for amusement or survival. The first casualty came without hesitation. A logistics officer, busy shuffling data pads, glanced at him too long. Baparaket's hand moved faster than thought, and a micro-dart found its mark through the officer's carotid. He crumpled against a console, data pads skittering across the floor. Baparaket noted the way the body tensed just before collapse, the final quiver of panic frozen mid-motion, and smiled slightly behind his mask. Another step forward, and a junior technician, arguing over recalibrating a life support subroutine, caught the glint of his movement. A silent blade flicked out from his wrist. The man's throat was cut cleanly, blood sparking against the polished deck. He did not pause to admire the result. These were merely observations, data points of reaction under duress. He paused outside the armory. Guards rotated predictably, too accustomed to routine. One reached for a rifle before realizing Baparaket had already eliminated him with a precise pneumatic dart. The other ducked instinctively, only to be snagged by a tripwire trap he had laid weeks ago, sending the man sprawling into a cluster of storage crates. Sparks erupted as the crates' panels collided with exposed power conduits, igniting small fires. Baparaket catalogued every sound, the panicked breaths, the sudden yelps, the metallic screech of collapsing storage. Each reaction a lesson in timing and fear. Passing through a cafeteria, he noticed two junior officers bickering over rations. Their noise grated on him, so petty, so unnecessary. A single flick of his wrist, and one was impaled through the temple with a micro-dart. The second spun toward him in alarm, and a secondary drone sent a shockwave across the floor, knocking him into the vending machines. He slumped, unconscious but alive for observation. The screams of the others mingled with the hiss of steam from nearby conduits, creating a symphony of chaos that Baparaket catalogued with detached interest. In the dimly lit maintenance tunnels, he orchestrated accidents with surgical precision. An engineer leaned over a coolant pipe. Baparaket nudged a moated cable, sending him toppling into live conduits. Sparks arced across his body. He twitched, convulsed, and went still. Nearby, two security officers collided while navigating the sudden debris he had introduced, and one's neck snapped against a metal beam. A micro-drone buzzed overhead, recording everything, feeding data back to Baparaket for later analysis. He lingered near a black market trustee's hideout, tucked deep in a shadowed sector of the station. The man froze, recognizing the presence of death before it struck. Baparaket savored the moment, watching the trustee's pupils dilate, noting the tremor in his hands. Then, a swift, silent dart found the man's chest. He collapsed into a heap of digital ledgers and credits. Baparaket retrieved the data, flipping through stolen financial secrets while leaving the body in a precise position to suggest an accident. Small psychological manipulations became his favorite. A junior analyst, curious and overeager, believed he had intercepted a hidden comms feed. Baparaket's motes glitched the system, sending an electromagnetic pulse through the console. Sparks flew, and the analyst's hair singed. A scream tore from his throat as he collapsed into a pile of filing trays. He watched the panic ripple outward. Nearby officers froze, their eyes scanning, unsure what caused the chaos. In the corridors leading to the lower docks, he left subtle traps. Motion sensors tripped in sequences designed to appear accidental, panels tilted at precise angles to create slipping hazards, and small drones hovered silently, waiting for anyone to pass. One officer, eager to confront what he thought was a minor sabotage, tripped on an incline panel. He fell into a maintenance drone, which activated a short circuit, sending an arc through the officer's chest. He twitched, convulsed, then lay still. Another casualty noted, another reaction logged. Baparaket paused near a communications hub, hearing whispers of the hunt being prepared against him. Mercenary brigades being briefed, contracts being drawn up. Words repeated like incantations. Make it clean. The low hum of anticipation in the office's voices grated, amused him. A communications clerk peered up, curious. A quick flick of a dart, and the clerk was a motionless figure slumping into a console. The pattern of minor, unrecorded killings was expanding across the station, leaving only whispers of fear in its wake. He approached the freight shuttle, slipping through the crowd. Every minor obstruction became a tool. A crane accidentally swung, tipping cargo boxes into maintenance staff. A security droid collided with an officer distracted by falling debris. A petty officer, curious about a misaligned security camera, was impaled by a shard of fallen glass. He moved like a phantom, each step leaving chaos in his wake. No one survived long enough to notice the pattern forming. A minor scuffle in the docking bay caught his attention. Two dockworkers argued over cargo sequencing. Baparaket's micro-drones nudged a support strut overhead. It fell precisely between them, crushing one instantly. The second attempted to flee but was caught in a tripwire he had laid the week prior. A shock dart found its mark. He slumped, twitching, face frozen in terror. Observing their reactions provided insight. The perfect mix of confusion, fear, and instinctive panic. He paused at a maintenance alcove, noticing a technician fiddling with a ventilation grid. The man's carelessness was delightful. Baparaket's motes activated a minor electrical discharge. The technician collapsed with a convulsive jerk, body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Nearby, a junior officer witnessing the event stumbled over the edge of a hatch he hadn't noticed, falling into the abyss below. The thrill was in the unpredictability, the way each death or injury propagated further fear. Even as he boarded the shuttle, he continued to tally and observe. Each minor kill, each panic-induced injury, fed his calculations for the next engagement. The station was alive with unseen deaths, with fear trickling through corridors, and with chaos that had no apparent source. Officers whispered rumors, misattributed causes, and blamed coincidences. None would suspect the calculated, psychopathic hand orchestrating everything from the shadows. He observed the shuttle loading bay from the hollow window. Crew scurried, docked cargo shifted, alarms buzzed briefly then self-corrected. Micro-traps continued to claim the curious. One man tripped over a cable and fell into a fuel conduit. Another misjudged a step and collided with a maintenance drone, sparks igniting his suit. Baparaket's eyes catalogued it all, noting human and alien, instinct, reaction time, and panic thresholds. As the shuttle lifted, he took in the orbital station. Hundreds of deaths, injuries, and psychological disruptions lay in the wake of his passage. Data feeds flashed. Operation Purge, while mercenary brigades prepared for contracts that would never catch him. Baparaket smiled faintly, not from satisfaction, but from anticipation. The hunt was not merely about survival. It was about control, manipulation, and observation. Every small kill, every minor chaos, was a rehearsal for the greater destruction still to come. The orbital station receded beneath him, alive with frantic activity, unaware of the full scope of the terror threading through its decks. He leaned back against the shuttle console, hollow sunlight washing half his face, and catalogued another dozen deaths that had gone unrecorded. Every incident, every scream, every twitch of fear was archived in his mind like a symphony of control. This was Baparaket's theater, his endless performance, and he would not exit until every note had been perfectly played. The hunt was on. The targets were unaware, the mercenaries unsuspecting, and the chaos spreading, an invisible storm behind him. Baparaket smiled. He had never been more alive. The landing thrusters roared against the copper-red sky of Quarath, kicking up clouds of metallic dust and sulfurous fumes that clung to every surface. The assassin stepped off the craft with a measured grace, his boots crunching over slag-coated gravel, the heat radiating from nearby molten vats making the metal beams glow like living veins. He paused, eyes scanning the vast industrial complex below, a sprawling labyrinth of catwalks, furnace towers, and conveyor belts stretching toward the horizon. Smokestacks belched ash, robotic cranes pivoted mechanically, and distant alarms intermittently screamed against the din of machinery. Patrols moved in predictable patterns. Cybernetic humans with ocular implants glinted in the low sunlight, their heavy boots echoing across the metal walkways. Alien mercenaries wielded vibro-lances, their multi-jointed limbs slicing through the air in disciplined arcs. Hovering drones, sensors, blinking in organized grids, swept the facility's perimeter. The assassin catalogued every movement, every patrol interval, every blind spot. From his high ledge, he traced probable kill sequences in his mind. Each death, each reaction, each collapse of flesh or machine analyzed clinically. A minor worker, careless and curious, wandered too close to the edge of a molten slag channel. Without hesitation, Baparaket flicked a wrist-mounted drone into position. The drone nudged a large support strut, dislodging it just enough that the man lost balance, teetering before toppling into the flowing molten metal. His scream was brief, the heat immediate, and Baparaket noted the pattern of panic that rippled through nearby maintenance bots and human workers. One panicked engineer attempted to throw a fire suppression module into the vat to rescue him. He miscalculated, and a short-circuited panel delivered a high-voltage shock, throwing him backward into a conveyor belt. Limbs snapped as machinery ground him, sparks flying over his convulsing form. The assassin smiled behind his holographic mask. Observation was everything, but the thrill of creation, the orchestration of fear and death, was the incentive. He moved silently across girders, adjusting the paths of molten vats with precision, calculating angles of descent for the next wave of pursuers. A squad of HQ assassins, alerted to his presence, approached through the lower tunnels. He did not rush. Instead, he watched, and the chaos came to him first. Molten metal hissed as it spilled from a controlled channel. One hunter, a cybernetic enforcer with pistons visible under his skin, stepped too close. His ocular implants shorted instantly, sparks erupting in his sockets, and the molten slag poured over his legs, welding armor to flesh. He screamed, thrashing before toppling into the flow, dragging his companions partially with him as the narrow catwalk collapsed under the unexpected weight. Another hunter, attempting to flank, misjudged the path of a swinging crane. A molten crucible, previously nudged into motion, swung with surgical timing, impaling him and sending him spinning into a storage vat. Baparaket's micro-drones whirred above, nudging debris into precise locations, shredding hovering surveillance drones midair. Sparks and molten fragments rained down, and the screams echoed through the complex like instruments in a symphony. Collateral damage was not incidental, it was integral. A maintenance drone toppled into a conduit, sending an electrical pulse across a section of the floor. Two minor engineers were fried instantly, their bodies twitching as circuits burned through their synthetic implants. A third, a panicked laborer, slipped into a vat of molten metal while attempting to flee, his scream cut short by the viscosity of the glowing substance. He moved like a phantom through the chaos. A small group of miners had been temporarily evacuated from a lower processing bay, but a few stragglers, curious or too slow, became part of his observational theater. A tripwire, invisible to the naked eye, caught one mid-step, yanking him into the path of a rotating hydraulic press. Limbs were severed, sparks flew, and the press ground on, continuing its automated rhythm. Baparaket noted the screams, the panic, and the instinctive attempts at self-preservation with cold amusement. Each sequence of death was logged mentally, a dataset for future optimization. Even the environment itself became a weapon. Corrosive chemical runoff channels were carefully nudged into breach points. One pursuing mercenary skidded on the slick surface, arms flailing before a discharge from a nearby exposed conduit ended the struggle. The smell of burning flesh and melted implants mixed with the acrid metallic fumes, a sensory collage that Baparaket catalogued like a meticulous archivist. A minor collision between a hover drone and a maintenance catwalk sent both into free fall. Two more pursuers vanished instantly, and another engineer caught in the debris was crushed under falling girders. He paused atop a catwalk to adjust micro-drone paths. Two more HQ hunters approached in synchronized steps, confident they had him cornered. He did not flinch. A nudge from a drone sent a fuel canister tipping into a containment vat. The resulting explosion threw both hunters across the walkway, their bodies skidding against molten rails before coming to a rest, smoldering and still. Sparks danced across the twisted wreckage, and Baparaket observed the panic in the remaining pursuers' eyes as they hesitated to advance. Nearby, a security technician attempted to access a control panel to reroute power. Baparaket's drone silently cut a support cable above him, sending a heavy metal panel crashing down. The technician had a fraction of a second to register the falling danger, raising his arms in a futile shield before impact. The crunch echoed through the industrial valley, a sharp punctuation to the orchestration of death. The assassin's eyes tracked the ripple effect. The way panic cascaded from one individual to the next, the sudden silence following a scream, the desperate attempts to flee colliding with mechanical hazards. Even minor, seemingly irrelevant workers became tools in his design. One laborer leaned too close to a molten slag chute, curious about a shifted grate. Baparaket flicked a wrist, and a micro-dart struck through the small opening in the grate, severing the man's carotid. His body fell into the flow below, and the following workers caught glimpses of death out of the corner of their eyes. The fear multiplied exponentially, each heartbeat of panic feeding the assassin's clinical interest. A maintenance bot, attempting to assess the source of a structural failure, misjudged the trajectory of a loose girder. It was sent crashing into a fuel conduit, sparking a minor explosion. Two more human and alien mercenaries caught in the radius were thrown backward, one impaled on a railing, the other slamming into a molten vat. Each death was precise, almost choreographed, a reflection of the assassin's obsession with perfect execution. Communication drones overhead were hijacked, broadcasting falsified alerts. A junior officer, misreading a digital feed, ran blindly into the path of a swinging crane. Baparaket adjusted a micro-mote in real time, ensuring the crane struck true. The man was obliterated instantly, leaving only a scorched silhouette of what he had been. The ripple effect sent two others stumbling into molten runoff channels. One was incinerated, the other convulsed as synthetic implants overloaded and melted. As night fell across Korath, the industrial complex glowed with fire and molten metal, shadows of bodies and machinery creating jagged patterns across the metal landscape. Baparaket moved methodically through corridors, catwalks, and lift shafts, leaving a trail of chaos that seemed both random and impossibly calculated. Minor workers, technicians, and pursuing hunters alike were eliminated without hesitation. A cybernetic mercenary impaled on a swinging slag scoop. Another electrocuted while attempting to override a malfunctioning generator. A maintenance drone repurposed as a trap crushing a small group of engineers against a support beam. He paused briefly at the edge of a molten vat, watching a pursuing officer approach. Without motioning, his micro-drones nudged a nearby support strut, causing a cascade of molten metal containers to tip. The officer's cry was cut short as he was swallowed by the glowing stream. Another hunter, trying to rescue him, misjudged a catwalk and plunged into a vat of liquefied metal, body melting almost instantly. The sensory details, the smell, the heat, the screams, were logged with meticulous attention. Finally, Baparaket ascended to a higher ledge, surveying the ruin below. The first wave of pursuers was annihilated, and minor, opportunistic kills had compounded into hundreds of individual deaths. Fires burned unchecked, machinery groaned under stress, and toxic vapors curled through the tunnels, claiming stragglers who dared to investigate. Communications from HQ crackled in the distance, warnings and panic laced and static. Baparaket smiled faintly behind his mask. The hunt had begun in earnest, and he had set the stage perfectly. The industrial night of Korath was alive with chaos, fear, and death, all under the guidance of one psychopathic conductor. The air was thick with the metallic tang of molten slag and the acrid bite of burning oil as Baparaket advanced deeper into the industrial labyrinth. Machinery groaned under the strain of overworked engines and warped metal frames. From above, the conveyor belts rattled, disgorging scrap and raw ore into storage chutes, and the distant roar of furnaces punctuated the mechanical cacophony. He crouched behind a support girder, sensors tracking the approaching HQ reinforcements. A mix of cybernetic enforcers with glowing ocular implants, adaptive alien mercenaries, and hovering reconnaissance drones. A lone pursuer rounded a corner, stepping cautiously on the graded walkway. The assassin's fingers brushed the edge of a micro-drone. "Careful where you step," he murmured under his breath, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. The drone released a high-voltage dart into the mercenary's cybernetic chest. Sparks arced violently. His scream was sharp and brief as circuits melted, sending him stumbling backward into a vat of molten slag. The molten metal hissed, consuming his body, and Baparaket noted every twitch, every convulsive jerk, recording the patterns of fear in his mind. "Who the hell?" another mercenary shouted, spotting the first body. Before he could complete the sentence, a hydraulic press, silently armed earlier, collapsed onto him. The crunch echoed across the steel catwalks, and Baparaket's smirk widened. From above, he nudged a dangling cable, sending sparks arcing across the walkway. Two minor maintenance bots short-circuited instantly. A human engineer, leaning too close to the railing, received a fatal shock, collapsing into a heap of twitching limbs and smoldering clothing. A squad of cybernetically enhanced hunters approached from the central furnace bay, communicating via encrypted channels. "Spread out. He can't be far," one growled, voice synthetic, ocular implants scanning rapidly. Baparaket tilted his head, voice dripping with mock concern through a hijacked comm frequency. "Oh, you'll find me, eventually. Hurry, don't make me wait." The line went silent for a moment, panic flaring across their HUDs as molten metal surged through newly opened channels he had manipulated earlier. One pursuer slipped on the heated metal, arms flailing before landing directly beneath a swinging ore container. Metal plates sheared through his chest, spraying molten slag in a grotesque fountain. Another hunter lunged to grab him, only to step onto a weakened catwalk. The structure gave way, and the man plunged 3 stories, impaled on a jagged steel beam. Baparaket moved with calculated ease, slipping across overhead girders. A small group of maintenance drones hovered nearby, scanning for anomalies. A flick of his wrist and a magnetic pulse sent one spinning into a vat of molten ore, the casing melting instantly. Another collided with a support column, electrocuting its sensors and frying the onboard AI. He watched, fascinated, as the remaining drone's pilot, an anxious junior engineer, tried desperately to recalibrate it. He stepped forward, and a collapsing cable pinned the engineer to the floor. Sparks licked across the man's torso. His cries rang out, sharp and fleeting, before silence claimed him. From a side corridor, an HQ officer barked orders, attempting to regain control. "Contain the breach. Focus fire." Baparaket's voice responded calmly over a hijacked channel, almost conversational. "Contain me? I think you misunderstand. I am the breach." A guard spun toward the source of the voice, eyes narrowing, but he never had the chance to identify the speaker. A micro-drone launched from the ceiling, slicing through his neck actuators with surgical precision. He crumpled silently, and Baparaket noted the subtle twitch of his limbs as his body finally went still. 2 others nearby attempted to drag him to cover, only to trigger an improvised slag trap. They screamed, one melting into the viscous metal, the other electrocuted against a live conduit. The assassin paused atop a catwalk, surveying the growing pile of corpses and smoldering machinery. His attention shifted to a lower furnace level, where a group of alien mercenaries attempted to flank him. With a low whistle, he activated a series of pressure valves, sending scalding steam bursting through the grates. One mercenary fell, convulsing violently as the superheated vapor blistered flesh and metal alike. Another lunged forward, only to be caught by a swinging molten ore bucket, impaled and sent spinning across the floor. The chaos was near perfect, each death both random and intentional, a manifestation of his clinical creativity. He moved silently through service ducts and maintenance shafts, planting micro-drones and hacking terminal controls. A group of technicians attempting to restore power stumbled into a conduit junction he had compromised. Sparks flew as one technician's exosuit shorted. He convulsed, collapsing against a molten slag flow, arms and legs immolated within seconds. Another tried to help, only to trip over a displaced panel, crashing into the vat with a wet, sizzling scream. "Anyone else want to volunteer?" he muttered quietly, almost amused, as he nudged a nearby support cable into position. The subtle shift triggered a chain reaction, sending 2 patrolling mercenaries tumbling into a vat of molten waste. Their screams harmonized into a grotesque symphony with the hiss of metal and the roar of furnaces. Baparaket's mind catalogued each sequence, each reaction, the pattern of fear and instinct. Collateral damage was expected, yet he treated it with the same detached precision as a chess master examining a complex board. A minor worker attempting to retrieve a fallen crate triggered another trap. A dangling beam fell, impaling him mid-step, the force throwing him across the molten floor. A pursuing drone, sent to record the chaos, was shredded by automated scrap metal projectiles, showering sparks across the melting machinery. Through hijacked comms, the remaining hunters tried to coordinate. "Target is using the environment. Avoid triggers," one barked, voice trembling. Baparaket's reply was calm, almost teasing. "I love it when you participate so willingly. Makes it easier." An engineer, caught in the crossfire while trying to restore a conveyor line, stepped onto a weakened grate. The floor gave way. He fell 3 stories into a vat of molten ore, his cry echoing across the industrial valley. Another misjudged the path of a swinging slag bucket, impaled, then dragged into molten metal. Micro-drones nudged debris to amplify each kill, turning the industrial facility into an orchestrated theater of death. The assassin paused at a controlled junction, eyes scanning for any remaining life. 2 cybernetic enforcers approached from opposite sides, clearly coordinated. He opened a vent and activated a high-pressure steam valve. One enforcer was blown backward, impaled on a corroded pipe, and the other scrambled, only to trigger an exposed wire conduit. Sparks arced across his chest, melting armor and flesh simultaneously. A small explosion from an unstable furnace chute sealed their fates. From a distance, a junior communications officer attempted to broadcast an alert. Code red, "Intruder." His voice was cut off as a metal girder, previously loosened by Baparaket's drone, fell across the console, crushing him instantly. Another engineer, peeking from a catwalk, was skewered by a dangling support beam, his scream lost amid the roar of molten metal and collapsing machinery. The chaos propagated exponentially. One hunter fell into a vat of molten slag while trying to rescue a colleague. The colleague misstepped on a weakened catwalk, plummeting several stories and impaling himself on exposed rebar. Minor workers and wandering drones caught in the sequence added to the tally, each death catalogued and observed with cold detachment. Baparaket ducked into a shadowed maintenance corridor. A pursuing mercenary, unfamiliar with the layout, turned the corner too quickly. A micro-drone tripped a cable, sending a kinetic charge into his chest. Sparks, fire, and body heat erupted simultaneously. Another drone, swooping to assist, collided with a crane, crushing it and impaling the operator inside. "I could do this all day," Baparaket murmured, voice low, almost conversational, as he nudged another cable into position. A pressure valve erupted, sending superheated liquid into a pursuing squad, melting armor and synthetic flesh alike. Screams echoed across the industrial complex, punctuated by explosions, the hiss of molten metal, and the sickening crunch of falling bodies. By the time he emerged to a higher observation platform, the industrial facility was a ruined, smoking wasteland. Fires licked across collapsed structures, molten metal pools reflected the blood-soaked carnage, and the echo of 100 deaths reverberated through the air. Communications from HQ crackled sporadically, filled with panic, curses, and orders for reinforcements. Baparaket stepped back, observing from a ridge above the complex. He could see the black smoke columns rising, twisted bodies and broken machines below, and the first wave of HQ pursuers obliterated. A faint smile broke across his lips. "You'll have to send more," he said softly into the wind, his voice carrying over the ruined metal valley. "I hope you brought enough." Above him, the copper sky began to darken. Smoke blending with dusk, fires reflected on his mask as he catalogued each kill, each environmental manipulation, each terrified reaction. The first wave was annihilated, but Baparaket knew HQ would escalate. The hunter had become the hunted, but in the chaos and slaughter, he thrived. Already, he was planning the next sequence, the next carnage, the next exquisite display of orchestrated death. The wind shrieked across the dunes of Ryloth Prime, sand biting at every exposed surface and slicing through armored suits like tiny, merciless knives. Visibility was near zero, and the assassin moved as if he was part of the storm itself, a shadow amidst the whirling metal grit. From a high dune, he observed a patrol of HQ mercenaries trudging along a predictable line, eyes scanning with synthetic precision. He released a micro-drone, its tiny frame gliding over the crests, sensors mapping weak points in their formation. A faint hum preceded the collapse of a sand tunnel beneath a lone mercenary. The dune buckled, swallowing him whole, a muffled scream lost in the howling wind. Nearby, another turned, shouting commands that dissolved into the storm. Baparaket's voice whispered across a hacked comm channel, almost teasing, "Try to keep up, won't you?" A pair of cybernetic trackers attempted to flank him, but the assassin had pre-positioned energy blades in the sand. One stepped on a hidden trigger. A curved blade shot up through the sand, severing legs and embedding deep into the armored torso. The second turned to flee and ran straight into a collapsing rock overhang, impaled by a jagged boulder he had subtly loosened hours before. He watched the convulsions, noting the reflexive panic, the twitch of limbs, the final exhalation. A merchant convoy carrying minor supplies passed along a ridge. Without hesitation, he fired a high-velocity projectile into a suspension cable, sending the heavily laden crates tumbling down the slope. One crushed a convoy handler instantly, another struck a mercenary square in the chest. Baparaket chuckled softly, "Always consider the fall." From behind a ridge, a communications officer tried to call reinforcements. The assassin nudged a dune fragment down on him, burying him alive just as his voice reached the static of the storm. Another drone, sent to locate him, faltered into a pit he had dug earlier, impaled on a jagged metal beam. Each death was catalogued with clinical attention, as though taking notes in a particularly gruesome laboratory experiment. The storm shifted him to a higher dune. From there, he could see the HQ reinforcements spread across the desert, confused by the shifting sands and sudden rockfalls. He hurled a sharpened fragment of metal into a patrol drone, slicing it in two. The pilot, a mercenary with cybernetic eyes, attempted evasive maneuvers but stumbled into a sand tunnel collapse. His cries echoed across the dunes, distorted by wind, and Baparaket allowed himself a slow, appreciative smile. "Patience," he murmured to himself. "It makes the chaos sweeter." From the swirling dust emerged a lone officer, scanning with a handheld energy scanner. Without hesitation, the assassin flicked a small kinetic drone, sending it skittering across the sand. It struck the officer in the chest, penetrating armor and shredding circuitry. He fell face first into the sandstorm, twitching, then still. Nearby, two mercenaries attempted a flanking maneuver. One stepped onto an unstable ledge. The sand beneath him gave way, sending him sliding headfirst into a jagged outcrop. The second tried to rescue him, only to be impaled by a concealed shard of metal protruding from the dune. Hours seemed to pass in the swirl of wind and debris. Baparaket moved silently between ridges, each step precise. A small band of patrols had split off to investigate a rockfall he had triggered earlier. He intercepted them with a micro-drone, electrified wires snaking from the sand to impale the first two attackers, frying their implants. Another tried to flee but stumbled into a trap he had rigged. A collapsing sand arch crushed the upper half of his body, leaving the lower half convulsing spasmodically. He noted the subtle adjustments hunters made in response, the reflexive fear patterns. Crossing into the remains of a minor mining outpost, he spotted a group of maintenance engineers attempting to restore operations. Without hesitation, he pulled a hidden lever, releasing a burst of sand and debris that buried three alive. Two tried to run, only to fall into a pit of molten scrap metal he had ignited with a delayed ignition pulse. Their screams were sharp and short-lived, a rhythmic accompaniment to the storm's howl. Above the dunes, orbital drones attempted to locate him, but he used the wind and reflective debris to scramble their sensors. One drone, confused, fell into a rock crevice he had prepared. Another collided with a flying patrol unit, both disintegrating in midair. Below, a lone engineer attempted to flee, but a falling dune fragment crushed him with a wet, metallic thump. Baparaket observed the randomness of panic with amusement, each death a variable in a grand experiment of fear. As the day shifted toward dusk, the assassin moved toward a cluster of mercenary bunkers. Outside, a small patrol tried to catch him in the open. Without hesitation, he activated a camouflaged hydraulic trap. A retractable wall embedded with jagged metal spikes shot upward, skewering two officers instantly. Another tried to detonate a grenade, but a perfectly timed magnetic pulse sent it back toward him, vaporizing half of the bunker's entryway. Inside the bunker, the remaining officers scrambled. He followed silently, activating a series of micro-drones to electrocute exposed circuits, sending sparks arcing through the steel beams. One mercenary reached for a comm relay. A kinetic shard from a reinforced doorframe pierced through his chest. Another tried to flee through the ventilation shaft but triggered a trap he had installed days prior. High-pressure metal panels collapsed, crushing him before he could move 10 feet. From a second-floor balcony, he watched a maintenance worker who had been sent to investigate alarms. The worker looked up, panic in his eyes. "Please, I don't know where he is." Baparaket's response was a whisper through hacked comms. "You do now." He tapped a cable running across the balcony. Sparks leapt, igniting the worker's fuel pack. He convulsed violently, shrieking, before toppling off the balcony into a vat of molten ore below. Nearby, a pair of mercenaries attempted a counterattack. One lunged at Baparaket, but the assassin's micro-drone severed the muscles in his legs. He collapsed, screaming, as a second drone skewered his torso. The other tried to drag him to cover but fell into a pit of molten slag. "Timing, always timing," Baparaket muttered under his breath, moving toward the ventilation ducts. The final few patrols, disoriented by the sandstorm and the havoc, tried to regroup. Baparaket released a timed micro-detonation under a nearby cliff. Rocks collapsed, crushing 2 mercenaries alive, while another, running too close to the edge, plummeted into the swirling sands below. He noted the panic in the survivors, each gesture predictable, each scream a note in his symphony of death. Emerging from the desert dunes, he observed the aftermath. Dozens of bodies scattered across the sand, patrol drones destroyed, and the first layer of HQ hunters obliterated. He catalogued every kill. The precise angle of impalement, the convulsions, the seconds before death. The wind carried screams and groans, which he listened to like a conductor observing an orchestra. "I hope HQ appreciates the effort," he whispered into the storm, voice lost in the roar, almost amused. "I try to make it memorable." He disappeared into a narrow canyon, leaving sand-blasted wreckage, shattered patrol units, and a dozen or more random victims behind him. Each kill was precise, impromptu, or simply opportunistic. If someone looked at him wrong, tripped where they shouldn't, or wandered into a hazard, he made sure they would never survive to speak again. From the canyon rim, he looked toward the horizon, where the storm churned violently. His gaze was clinical, detached, yet there was a gleam in his eyes, a faint smirk tugging his lips. The desert had been lethal, the first wave of planetary chaos had begun, and Baparaket thrived in the carnage, already calculating where to strike next, how many more would fall, and how beautifully the deaths would cascade across the dunes. The zero-gravity corridors of Vayner City's floating skyscrapers twisted around him, a labyrinth of metal and glass suspended in midair. Baparaket adjusted his magnetic boots, grappling hooks securing him to the nearest support beam. The assassin's eyes scanned every movement, elite HQ hunters and thrusters, drones weaving erratically between buildings, and civilian observers trapped in glassed observation decks. He flicked a micro-drone into the air. It zipped silently along the edge of a skybridge. A hunter moving along a maintenance track noticed it too late. Baparaket's whispered command through hacked comms was a soft, casual drawl. "Catch it if you can." The drone slashed upward, cleaving through his shoulder actuator. He tumbled off the bridge into the void, spinning as a faint scream echoed into the city. Another hunter turned, only to be skewered by a kinetic shard launched from a nearby catwalk. Floating cargo containers drifted too close, and Baparaket manipulated their momentum with grappling lines. One container smashed into a patrolling drone mid-flight, obliterating its sensors. A maintenance worker, standing near the edge of a platform, froze in panic. Baparaket tapped a hidden magnetic trigger. The deck beneath him buckled, sending the worker plummeting into the void below. The scream echoed faintly, but it didn't bother him. He catalogued it, noting how fear affected reaction times. 2 hunters tried to corner him in a zero-G atrium. Baparaket let them advance, then triggered a low-oxygen chamber he had previously hacked. They choked and clawed at their masks, panic flaring in their eyes. One lunged for an emergency release panel. Baparaket's micro-drone severed its cables. The panel collapsed, impaling the hunter. The second struggled, flailing in thin air, and collided with an unsecured floating container, disintegrating under the impact. "Never quite learn, do you?" he muttered, voice calm over the comm channel they couldn't detect. He swung across a skybridge, landing silently on a maintenance tower. 3 engineers emerged, their hands raised. One was immediately struck by a concussive blast from a hidden micro-drone, which sent him spinning into the side of the tower. The second stumbled backward into a collapsed railing, impaled by twisted metal. The third tried to flee across a narrow catwalk. Baparaket used a magnetic pulse to bend the walkway mid-step, hurling him into the void with a metallic scream. The city below quivered as he manipulated environmental hazards. Hover platforms carrying civilians were destabilized. One flipped, spilling passengers into each other, crushing 2 beneath the overturned vehicles. A dropped energy conduit arced through the metal hull of a floating building, electrocuting 2 minor maintenance bots and a mercenary in the same stroke. Every death, every squeal, every convulsion was recorded in his mind with obsessive precision. By the time he left Vayner City's upper levels, he had eliminated nearly a dozen HQ hunters, 3 minor civilian workers, and multiple patrol drones. He moved to Xanther Forge, volcanic industrial world, where molten rivers and immense factories offered new ways to exercise his craft. The heat hit him first, acrid and metallic, the roar of industrial machinery reverberating through every corridor. Baparaket observed a convoy of HQ mercenaries moving through the catwalks above a molten vat. He grinned. He activated a series of hydraulic cranes, sending molten steel swinging with surgical timing. One hunter froze mid-step as a cascade of molten steel poured from the crane into his chest, fusing armor and flesh instantly. Another tried to leap clear, only to miscalculate the trajectory and plummet into a spinning conveyor belt that shredded both man and machine. "Always a better way to die," he whispered, voice lost amid the roar of metal and fire. A secondary team tried to flank him, using vertical lifts to gain elevation. He rigged a countermeasure. The lift cables snapped under heat stress, sending cages plummeting onto the pursuers. 2 mercenaries were crushed, another flung into molten runoff. A minor engineer ducked behind a railing, only to be hit by a hot metal shard that pierced his chest, his body tumbling into a river of molten ore. He navigated through multi-level catwalks, each step precise, a predator moving through a maze he controlled. Another hunter attempted a direct assault, firing energy pulses. Baparaket dodged, planting a magnetic charge on the adjacent rail. The pulse destabilized it, launching the hunter into a vat of molten steel. A maintenance drone, floating nearby, was instantly vaporized by the same blast. In a central assembly line, Baparaket spotted 3 new HQ operatives. Moving cautiously, he triggered a sequence of machinery. Conveyor belts moved at impossible speeds, crushers activated in a precise rhythm, and molten slag was rerouted to the kill zone. One operative was impaled by an automated press, another's head was crushed against a spinning drum, the third tried to flee but slipped into a vat of molten metal. Between floors, minor workers had wandered back, curious about alarms. He dispatched them without hesitation. A hydraulic press caught 2, dropping heavy steel sheets onto them. Another stumbled into a vat he had prepared for molten slag. Yet another was electrocuted by a short-circuited walkway. He catalogued every reaction: fear, flailing, screams, and the final moment of stillness. Baparaket paused briefly to watch the chaos. Fires raged, machinery collapsed, and molten rivers overflowed. He noted patterns in the hunter's behavior, how panic disrupted tactics, and how fear could be exploited for maximum efficiency. A voice came from a damaged comm relay. "Baparaket, this isn't sanctioned." "Withdraw," he smirked. "I never really liked rules," he muttered before severing the relay with a micro-drone, electrocuting the operator instantly. On the upper catwalks, 3 mercenaries attempted a coordinated strike. Baparaket anticipated each move. One fell through a collapsed grate, landing on molten metal below. The second collided with swinging industrial scaffolding, impaled instantly. The third lunged at him with a vibroblade, only to have a magnetic field flip him into a vat of molten ore. The factory was a symphony of death. Automated cranes, molten rivers, moving platforms, and electric arcs danced to his silent rhythm. Every decision was a kill. Minor workers, curious engineers, and every remaining hunter were fair game. By the time he moved to the factory's upper observation deck, nearly 4 dozen individuals had perished at his hands, each death calculated, each panic measured. Emerging from the factory's inferno, Baparaket surveyed the planet's night sky, the molten glow of Xanther Forge lighting his reflection on the domed observation window. He spoke into a hacked comm channel, voice low and controlled. "Send reinforcements. I'll be here to greet them." He wasn't boasting, he was noting variables, preparing for the next engagement. Below, minor rebellion sparked among surviving laborers and small mercenary units, their fear-stoking chaos. Each death, each reaction, fed his understanding of planetary combat, human, or alien, behavior under extreme duress. The final phase of the planetary rampage brought him to the transport docks. Several HQ reinforcements attempted to intercept him, arriving in hovercraft and armed with orbital-linked drones. He released a concealed charge, collapsing the loading platforms. 2 hovercraft plummeted into molten slag channels. Occupants were vaporized instantly. One surviving mercenary attempted a desperate assault. Baparaket's micro-drone skewered him through the chest. Another slipped on molten runoff, falling beneath the tracks of a heavy industrial loader. As he prepared to depart, a group of miner workers, stragglers from earlier evacuations, peered at him in terror. Without hesitation, he dispatched them. A retractable catwalk triggered, crushing 3 beneath it. Another was electrocuted by an exposed high-voltage line. The 5th fell into a vat of cooling molten metal. The pattern was simple. Those who watched, those who feared, those who interfered, all became part of his dataset. By the time Baparaket secured a stolen transport, the factories and industrial zones of Xanther Forge were in ruins. Skies burned orange from fires, molten rivers glowed through shattered ceilings, and dozens of HQ hunters, drones, and miner workers lay dead. His tally was approaching 60 individual kills across planetary shifts, with collateral chaos numbering in the hundreds. He settled into the transport, surveying the aftermath through thermal and surveillance overlays. Each planet was a canvas, each kill a brushstroke. In zero gravity, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smirk. "The first wave is complete," he whispered. "And we've barely begun." As hyperspace lanes opened before him, Baparaket plotted his return to HQ, already calculating responses, reinforcements, and the perfect sequence of kills to come. He catalogued every scream, every convulsion, every desperate act of survival. In his mind, the hunt was never ending, and the thrill of planetary-scale carnage was far from exhausted. The planet spun beneath him, scorched and bleeding in the aftermath of his orchestrated chaos. Cities lay in ruins, glass towers shattered into skeletal frameworks, transport grids twisted into molten veins, and industrial complexes had collapsed into jagged heaps of metal and fire. Baparaket observed all of it from his micro-drone feed, the quiet hum of his craft mingling with the distant crackle of fires on the surface. Each pixel, each flicker, each civilian figure left in frozen panic was catalogued and mentally indexed for later analysis. Stepping through the shattered streets of a minor trade city on a remote system, he moved like a shadow, boots crunching over debris and human remains alike. A child clutched a scorched doll at the edge of a collapsed plaza. He paused for a fraction of a second, tilting his head as if weighing the decision, then activated a micro-drone that emitted a silent pulse. A broken building section above the child gave way, pinning the figure beneath a fallen beam. Baparaket noted the terrified movements of a nearby survivor. One civilian attempted to flee across a weakened bridge. He tapped a nearby conduit, sending an electrical discharge through the support, and the bridge twisted like paper underfoot, flinging the panicked individual into the void below. He murmured quietly, "Efficiency is everything," and moved on. Minor authority figures began to intervene. Riot control mechs clanked toward him, their sensors sweeping systematically. Baparaket chuckled softly. He ducked into the skeletal remains of a commerce tower and manipulated a compromised maglock on the nearest stairwell. 2 mechs, following standard patrol routes, tripped the magnetic field simultaneously, crashing into one another with grinding metal shrieks. One pilot, a junior officer, stumbled out of the wreckage, only to be skewered by a snapped rebar jutting from the collapsed stairwell. A second attempted to fire a plasma weapon at him. A micro-drone zipped past, short-circuiting the gun and electrocuting the operator. The chaos escalated. Firearms discharged randomly, ricochets igniting fuel lines in a nearby plaza. Civilians scattered, screams and panic painting the air. Baparaket used the environment as an extension of his psychopathy, collapsing elevated roads under pursuit squads, activating dormant fuel depots with timing calibrated to precision, and triggering failing energy shields to trap groups of officers. One squad of tactical officers, desperate and coordinated, advanced through a tunnel he had already prepared. Molten chemical runoff leaked from compromised pipelines, flooding the passage. The first officer to step forward screamed as his cybernetic augmentations shorted, the second slipped into the acid-laced liquid. The third, attempting to retreat, was crushed under the weight of a collapsed support beam. Baparaket paused atop a crumbling observation tower, his eyes cold, calculating. He whispered into a comm channel that had been hacked just enough to reach HQ's minor relays, sending regards to your newest recruits. Immediately, a squad of unarmed clerical personnel wandering through the lower floors of the tower were caught in the automated countermeasure. Security gates snapped shut, crushing two, while an automated fire suppression unit vented scalding steam across the corridor, scalding three more. His tally of random kills grew effortlessly. By the time he moved into the central market district of a second planetary system, the city's infrastructure was already failing. He observed a group of civilians attempting to scavenge supplies from a shattered transport depot. A single wave of his micro-drones sent heavy crates toppling. One crate pinned a man to the ground while another rolled over a trio of workers. Baparaket muttered quietly to himself, adaptation is key. Another squad of minor authority officers attempted to contain the panicked civilians. He rigged the plaza's collapsing scaffolding to fall along their patrol paths. 7 were killed instantly. 3 survived but suffered crushing injuries. Resistance is unnecessary, he said, voice calm and clipped, as he maneuvered past the chaos, each step precise, each kill meticulously documented in his mind. 2 more micro-drones zipped along the streets, electrocuting stray law enforcement officers and civilians who wandered too close to the hazards he'd prepared. One minor officer shouted, "This isn't sanctioned." Baparaket answered only with a soft chuckle. Sanctioned, unsanctioned, names don't matter when the outcome is predictable. He manipulated a failing bridge with a magnetic pulse, sending 3 additional pursuers plunging into a chasm filled with molten runoff. The screams echoed faintly through the half-collapsed cityscape. He continued into the shattered industrial sector. Factories, once humming with the activity of workers, were now mazes of twisted metal and molten slag. A group of engineers, ignorant of his presence, wandered into a hazard zone he had meticulously prepared. One stepped onto a weakened catwalk and collapsed into molten metal below. Another was pinned under a falling crane. A third attempted to escape across a conveyor belt, only to be flung into spinning machinery that shredded him instantly. He watched, fascinated by the instinctive reactions, the flailing, the desperate attempts to survive. HQ attempted to respond, sending orbital patrol drones. Baparaket intercepted them with micro-drones, causing collisions and electrical feedback loops that destroyed 3 immediately. He whispered, "You always underestimate the environment," as a 4th patrol drone careened into a factory smokestack, exploding in midair and sending flaming debris into a group of minor security officers, killing 4 more. Across the markets and transport hubs of the second planet, his hand extended through indirect means. Collapsing scaffolds, short-circuited maglocks, electrified support beams. Random kills accumulated. A street vendor crushed under a rolling container. A minor bureaucrat electrocuted by a failing energy conduit. A courier flung into molten chemical runoff. He paused briefly to watch the spread of fear ripple across survivors, cataloging panic responses, escape patterns, and the effectiveness of environmental terror as a weapon. At nightfall, the assassin moved through a neutral transport station, crowded with fleeing civilians. He manipulated gravity dampeners on several conveyor tubes, sending 4 unarmed individuals tumbling into spinning mechanical gears. A minor patrol unit attempted to engage him in the chaos. 2 were caught under falling debris. The third was skewered by a magnetic scaffold he had prepared. He murmured quietly, almost conversationally, "Impatience is fatal." By the time he withdrew to a vantage point above the planetary surface, he had killed nearly 75 individuals across the cities and industrial sectors. HQ hunters, minor officers, unarmed civilians, and curious workers. Each kill was random, opportunistic, and precisely executed, a testament to his escalating psychopathy. He sat quietly atop a cliff overlooking the cities, using surveillance drones to watch fires, panic, and structural collapse. A minor rebel leader appeared on one feed, shouting orders, rallying survivors. Baparaket whispered, coordination, predictable, and triggered a preset hydraulic hazard, crushing the leader and scattering his followers. More screams filled the feed, echoing across the channels. Baparaket, a corrupted comm signal hissed. "You're destabilizing everything." He smiled thinly. "That's the point." The voice sputtered into static. He watched as cities burned, molten rivers glowed through shattered districts, and orbital patrols scrambled hopelessly. His psychopathy thrummed in his chest. This was no longer strategy. It was enjoyment, a symphony of panic, fear, and death. He left the planetary system in stolen shuttles, surveying the devastation. Multiple cities destroyed, countless innocents dead, HQ hunters annihilated, and minor security forces decimated. Every death was a note in his growing catalogue of chaos, every scream a signal that the next planetary system would be worse. His tally of random kills across multiple systems had now passed 100 individuals, with hundreds more in collateral deaths, food distribution centers, transport convoys, and industrial facilities obliterated. As hyperspace opened before him, Baparaket adjusted the helm and spoke quietly to himself. "I wonder who will try next, and how beautifully I can dispose of them." He tapped into surveillance feeds for the next targets, scanning planets, industrial hubs, and HQ staging areas. Each micro-drone beeped with data as he catalogued routes, weak points, and environmental hazards. The blood trail he left behind would be studied, feared, and remembered, but he did not care. The only thing that mattered was the hunt, the kills, and the expanding scope of his psychopathy. The chapter closed with Baparaket watching multiple worlds burning in his psychic shadow, the screams of innocence a quiet accompaniment to his methodical planning. HQ would escalate, reinforcements would come, and yet he thrived in the anticipation. Every new kill would be more random, more psychotic, more devastating. He did not slow. Where others sought respite, Baparaket leaned forward, tasting raw escalation like a drug. He drifted through orbit and hyperspace until the next cluster of systems unfolded before him. Contested trade hubs, remnant colonies, and peripheral mining colonies starved for order. Each world was a palette and every life a brushstroke he could choose to ruin or erase. He smiled, slow and patient, and led the hunt resume with a kind of ritualized cruelty. He began by watching the incoming comms, hunting for weak points in the flurry of emergency broadcasts. HQ barked into every open channel, containment, curfew, authorized strikes. He replied through a dozen stolen voices on hijacked relays, sowing panic with a precision that made the men on the other end think their navies were failing. "They're inside your feed. Don't trust the uplink," he whispered, the phrase replaying in squads' headsets long after he'd switched off the link. Men ran, paged, argued, exactly as he'd predicted. On his first stop he found a satellite city, once a polished node of commerce, now half dark and brittle from his earlier games. He slipped through maintenance ducts like a shadow, boots muffled against insulation. The city had reallocated its patrols in clumsy quadrants, leaving seams for a predator with patience. A street preacher preaching about salvation caught his eye. The man's face was wet from smoke and prayer, hands raised to a skyborn audience. Baparaket approached as if to listen. He smiled to the standing crowd, let his fingers brush the preacher's jaw, and closed the man's throat with a light, practiced motion. The preacher sagged, toppling into his congregation. Pandemonium flared and bodies surged. A scraping of boots, a shouted prayer, a frantic attempt to pull the body from a child's grasp. Baparaket watched each micro-reaction like a scientist reading a data feed. Another life removed, another shockwave fed into a population the size of a spoil. He became casual about it. An elevator full of office workers on a midday shift, doors jammed by the maintenance ghost he'd planted days before, turned from annoyance to death when he slipped a microfilament across the cabin. No dramatic flourish. The filament tightened, a single silent cut, and the people inside went slack, the hum of gravity and bureaucratic chatter swallowed by the sudden stillness. He left the bodies as a tableau. The janitorial bots would do the cleanup. He noted how quickly the remaining staff dispersed, how rumor cascaded, how the office that once demanded punctuality now emptied in trembling silence. He toyed with markets like a drummer tapping out rhythm. At a food bazaar he reversed a refrigerated storage line, enzyme vats auto-warmed, steaming open containers of grown protein. Shoppers fled as the air filled with a chemical tang that made the eyes sting. One elderly vendor, old and stubborn, refused to abandon his stall. He watched the old man's fingers reach for a falling crate, then the way a sudden magnetic glitch sent the crate collapsing into the vendor's chest. The vendor's neck broke like brittle wood. Baparaket recorded the nuance of reaction, the way survivors clustered into alleys, how families suffocated their noise, how small markets shuttered overnight. They sent hunters, always they sent hunters, fresh faces with sanctioned rage and sanctioned weapons. He welcomed them like old acquaintances. A strike team dropped into a lower transit hub thinking stealth would save them. Baparaket had already hollowed the ground under their feet. The platform gave as their boots landed. 3 fell into a maintenance pit lined with jagged rebar and exposed conduits. 1 tried to climb back and was sliced by an oscillating cutter he had wired to the pit's maintenance arm. Another, losing purchase, slid into a pool of hydraulic oil and ignited when a ruptured line sparked a fireball. He watched the flames lick bone and polymer and logged the precise second that sound became only heat. Dialogue was currency and delight. Through a turned-over station intercom he replied to a frantic commander. "You're 3 minutes late," he said, voice immaculate and bored. "I gave you a window." "Pity." The commander's reply, a roar full of authority and curses, made him laugh. A bulletproof officer tried to trace the call. Baparaket pinged the feed with a might of corrupted telemetry and watched the officer curse as his console looped. That officer cursed again and took the nearest stairwell. As he ascended, Baparaket had the stairs balustrade sheared just so. The officer's fall was precise, a clean break of spine against a twisted metal rung. He hit the lower walkway and did not move. Anyone watching that feed would see only the calculated randomness, slips, trips, accidents, but the dataset in Baparaket's head read as deliberate, tuned, intimate. On a colony moon, he retaught an entire lower-class neighborhood the lesson of vulnerability. Food rations were looted by panic. He salted the looters' caches with tiny, improvised charges that detonated with a concussive punch and a choking puff of aerosolized agent. Stun, not kill, he thought at first. He watched how that changed minds. Those who survived the first blast ran screaming to a supposed shelter, where he had disabled emergency locks. The shelter became a kiln of human desperation. People stamped on one another to find exits. A woman trampled as the doors jammed. An old child crushed by the surge of bodies, ribs collapsing like brittle shells. He ran a micro-drone along the surface of a nearby gas line and nudged a valve. The escaping fuel ignited in a jagged bloom, taking the shelter and its fleeing occupants in a heat bloom he would later describe in his ledger as efficient. Faces had become a narrative. Little, private reasons replaced strategic aims. A petty magistrate who had once sanctioned a drone culling program on an agricultural moon now found himself set upon in his personal quarters by Baparaket's approach. A pair of quietly launched microblades folded his throat, then rewired his quarters' life support to sterilize the evidence with a slow flood of dry nitrogen. He died in silence, blue and still, and Baparaket took his biometric token not for use. No, he kept it as an artifact, a reminder of how quickly power could be excised. Even the innocent, for the simple pleasure of it, fell. A woman pushing a cart of groceries across a boulevard paused to look up at a hollow sky. A micro-drone's shutters snapped and a ceramic bolt found her nape. A child in a tattered uniform dropped his toy and chased it. A magnetic strip on a transit grating snagged his foot and sent him down into a mechanical maw no one could reach in time. He snuffed lives like cigarettes, each one an anecdote, a marginal note in the ledger of his pleasure. He exploited rites and rituals with exquisite malice. A marriage procession moving slow and bright under city lanterns was ambushed not by guns but by collapse. Decorative canopies had been loaded with compromised ballast. At the precise moment the couple kissed, the ballast released. A metal beam fell, shearing half the procession. An uncle held a child to his chest, the child's skull crushed, The uncle's arms shredded as he tried to protect the body. People screamed. Religious leaders prayed impotently. Baparaket watched and marked the way grief hardened into outrage, useful for coaxing reactionary forces into errors. Every method was a lesson. He learned how bodies piled to create choke points, how fear concentrated people into predictable clusters, how authority crumbled when its men were seen to die in small, humiliating ways. He recorded the psychological fallout like forensic science, how rumors metastasized into full-scale riots, how a city's market stopped moving, how black markets spun red with the blood of their patrons. His drones mapped terrain while his fingers mapped the anatomy of terror. HQ's response twisted from procedural to frantic. Elite hunters arrived with adaptive AI, neural dampeners, and pathogen detection rigs. He met them with a graceless ballet of chaos. In a low-orbit transit hub, 3 hunters tracked his feed and thought themselves clever. Pin him by cutting power, their commander's whisper suggested. Baparaket had already reprogrammed the power grid to reroute overload into emergency bus lines, turning silence into shrapnel. As the hunters unplugged console nodes, a sequence of pressure bombs belched down the maze of air ducts. The hunters' helmets began to whisper, seals clicking, their comms jammed, their suits cracking open from internal shock. One staggered out with half of his face hanging away, blood fountained like a grotesque lamp. Another tried to detonate an EMP in retaliation. Baparaket had anticipated this and wired the EMP to feed back through the hunter's own neural dampeners. The scream, oh, the scream, transmits in his memory like a bell that tolls in a roomful of glass. He increased the theater of death's randomness to sow hysteria. Security dispatchers were sent false manifests. Medbot units were delayed by jammed corridors whose controls he had frozen with thermite-tipped micromodes. Rescue convoys drove into cul-de-sacs and found their exits sealed by collapsed infrastructure he'd engineered. He watched their faces through hacked feeds as oxygen levels dropped, their eyes bulging, their voice circuits warbling into unintelligible frequencies. He listened, sat back, and decided which of them would beg first. When a young field medic finally whispered his name, begging, calling Baparaket an angel, a savior, Baparaket said nothing. He left the medic to suffocate slowly while he composed a note to HQ. 2 lines, polite. Your people learn quickly. Attached were the Medbot feed logs and time-stamped GPS blots, proof of the lesson. Wherever he went, violence begot more violence. A scavenger gang retaliated against a neighborhood they believed had sheltered assassins. Baparaket fed them incendiary detonators in the night and watched as the mob burned down tenements, some sheltering women and children, while the scavengers cheered. He flicked their radios with a frequency he owned and played back the cries of their victims at high pitch. The scavengers turned on one another within hours. He sat on the horn of a silent starport, feeding in rumors to both sides, sipping synthetic coffee, enjoying the delicious entropy. Mass communications became his weapon too. He hacked municipal billboards and fed them images of worst-case outcomes. Children frozen in bruised limbs, leaders cowering in ruined palaces, markets emptied and red-rimmed. The images looped, panic rose, food lines collapsed into fights. He timed the collapse of a water reclamation plant to coincide with a viral feed. More people fought to secure water at a single pump and were gassed by a diesel flare downtown he'd lit through a hacked fuel regulator. The crowd crushed a volunteer worker to death in the ensuing tangle. Baparaket marked the time and the way the crowd's anger turned inward, at each other. When a group of small world governors convened emergency tribunals and attempted to lobby for a negotiated cessation, he infiltrated their secure channel disguised as one of their own aides. He sent a simple, cold file, names and coordinates in the handwriting of someone close to them, and waited. Assassins towing the lines of honor, thinking their contracts righteous, followed the coordinates and found only an ambush he'd laid for them. Poisoned air vents, a collapsing gallery, men pulled into the void through pressure relief hatches. The lobbyists who had pushed for prudence were torn down in the hallways, their faces bruised and broken, their shields useless. It was poetic, he told himself, and he stored the details like a collector of rare insects. His kills multiplied, not always by terror tactics but by simple strolling violence, the quickest, rawest method when speed meant survival. He walked into cafes, smiled, and slit the throat of a man who had given him a look. He sat beside a woman on a tram and placed a ceramic bolt beneath her scarf, then watched as the bolt took hold and her head rolled to one side. He did not always need an audience. Some deaths were private pleasures, glimpses of power. A street violinist stopped playing mid-note as his throat closed. A pair of lovers arguing on a balcony were separated by a single, precise blade through the heart. He had begun to collect little reasons for killing in a mental scrapbook: an impatient jerk, a loud laugh, a hand on the wrong shoulder at the wrong moment. By the time the networks began rerouting resources fully toward him, by the time whole fleets orbited potential systems, he had moved on to new theaters. He left behind cities with their markets looted, their institutions hollowed, and their citizens either caged by curfews or raging in street battles. He left bodies in patterns, sometimes squares, sometimes radial bursts that read like signatures to those who had time to connect dots, and he left breadcrumbs meant to ensure that HQ's hunters would not forget who had humbled them. He wanted them angry. Angry people were sloppy, sloppy people bled. He never stayed to be thanked or cursed. He moved with the economy of a man who treated lives as trivial as empty bottles. Before he burned away into hyperspace again, he checked his logs. Hundreds of kills this cycle, some by the environment, many by knife and dart and film, dozens by the systemic collapses he engineered. He tallied them in the ledger in his head, not out of record keeping but as a litany, each name, each moment, an incised thing he could return to in private. His final message was short, broadcast across the last dying hull of a ruined system: "You will not stop me. You only refine me." He watched his own words crawl across every emergency dashboard, and in the minute that followed, a minute of static and emergency sirens, he felt the specific, electric pleasure of a man who had turned fear into his language. The galaxies burned, and he kept walking, a quiet smile beneath his mask, hunting, learning, and more psychotic than ever. He slipped through the low traffic lanes like an apparition folded into commuter drift. A shuttle painted with the dull corporate gray of freight clearance and the kind of manifest that never raised more than an eyebrow. Erythra's orbital ring came into view as a halo of steel and glass, satellite arrays like teeth baked in reflected light. He watched the HQ from multiple angles through moats and hacked sat feeds, a dozen cameras feeding his HUD so that the station felt less like a fortress and more like an organism with predictable tics. He mapped the defense grids and orbital turrets as if reading the pulse of a living thing: timing of sweeps, arcs of fire, blind spots created by maintenance shadows. The station's automated shields had a rhythm. He learned to hum along. He coasted the shuttle into a crowded lane, an invisible ghost among traffic. Cloaking mesh swallowed the craft's heat signature and decoy drones flared false blips across scanners. He let automated port authorities wave him through with the bored attention of bureaucrats whose scanners had not been taught to suspect miracles. From a maintenance bay he released a swarm of micro-drones that slipped into vents and conduits like beetles. Their sensors mapped patrol rotations, noted guard sleep cycles, and recorded the dull habits of men who thought themselves safe behind regulations. He catalogued every subtly lit maintenance hatch, every emergency elevator with a recorded 1 in 5 failure, every fuel conduit with a documented micro-leak, each a potential vector. The tunnels smelled of ozone and old coffee and recycled fear. Flickering strip lights threw garbage-shaped shadows onto metal. He moved by the small things: a loose grate with a screw missing, a floor panel with a hairline crack, a technician's badge left on a bench. He disabled patrol drones in the dark with micro-bolts that peeled coatings and let circuits die in oxygen-hungry sparks. He walked through corridors humming with the low life support thrumming underfoot, and for amusement's sake he sometimes left a tiny signature, a moded echo in an administration terminal to cause a login loop, a false maintenance update to delay a patrol 3 minutes. Those 3 minutes were everything. He enjoyed the art of slipping past laser grids and sensor sweeps more than the violence that would follow. The grids had a polite arrogance. They timed their pulses like metronomes, and he timed his steps to become the rest note. He whispered through vents, reprogrammed a turret's friendly frequency to ignore a maintenance drone, and watched as the machine lowered its muzzle in supposed brotherhood. A security rover, cheerful and dutiful, patrolled a stairwell that he had wired. He tapped its control and the rover turned, bumping straight into a buffet cart tipped with a sabotaged coolant tank. The tank ruptured, the rover convulsed and went inert in a wash of steam and blue sparks. A passing janitor cursed and slipped on the slick. Baparaket watched the man crash into the stairwell, cracking his skull on a service rail. The man bled out before help arrived because med-bot priority was routed elsewhere. He logged the silent arithmetic of who helped whom and when. Initial contact came like a cord. A team of cybernetic guards, faces lit with HUD lines, rounded a corner. Their exoframes moved with efficient violence. He had prepared for their pride. A ceiling conduit he had tampered with collapsed in slow, precise motion, the fall shearing actuators from a lead guard, sending him into a tangle of shredded wiring. Another guard lunged and found his knee actuator dead as a slipped wire met a micro bolt. He collapsed, and a nearby maintenance crate toppled, crushing his chest. The third fired reflexively, only to be greeted by a micro-drone that jammed his implants. His own exoframe misinterpreted commands and clamped him down until his internal lines burst. He walked among them afterward, quiet as a taxman, hands gloved, pockets full of tiny data snips from their IDs. Each body was a lesson in where arrogance met machinery. He took pleasure in small, personal cruelties as he advanced. In a service corridor, a junior analyst muttered into an unsecured comm, "Someone's child lost, someone's mother gone," and Baparaket, passing, took a wrist-long shard of ceramic and slipped it into the man's neck from behind as though tucking a ribbon. The man slumped quiet and sudden. Guards who found the body cursed and radioed the floor. He watched their panic blossom and timed how fast command would reroute resources. When med-bots arrived and prioritized, the team that could have been in the command net was busy. He enjoyed the domino order of it. He was a small, methodical plague. The first real firefight was an ugly, up-close affair. Elite hunters cut across maintenance plazas, their AI-assisted pistols flaring. He answered not with brute force but with choreography. A hydrofluoric vent he had rerouted hissed at the perfect moment, eating briefly at a hunter's leg plating and causing the man to jump back, exposing his neck. An energy blade from a wrist mount finished what corrosion started. Another hunter rushed an access ladder. A rigged panel collapsed and slew him down through a shaft where crushing gears took a rest. More fell to electrocution when a conduit he'd overloaded dumped current into their armored frames. The kills were immediate and messy, but he liked the way they taught his prey to anticipate the environment as a weapon rather than merely a backdrop. Alarms screamed. Red lights painted the halls like wounds. He used that to his advantage. In the panic, groups fractured. Patrols ran into dead ends he had prepped and found their exits sealed. A security lead tried to order a retreat, clacking obscenities into a comm. He intercepted the line, putting his voice through the feed. "Fall back? You first," he said, calm and velvet soft, and then cut the line to leave the order circulating like a rumor. Guards began executing scripted fallback maneuvers into choke points. He had those choke points wired. When they poured through, retracting gates snapped shut on shoulders, automated crushing plates engaged, and the corridor turned into a funnel of exploding pressure and bone-jamming hydraulics. He watched bodies fold and hold the line with broken limbs as if they were props. He kept dialogue minimal but cutting. An officer, one who had come to manage him in person, found himself cornered by shadow and whisper. "You're not supposed to be here," the officer said, breathless, voice going electronically thin. Baparaket smiled politely. "And yet here I am." He flipped a wrist. A microfilament looped, tight as a harpstring, and the officer's vocal cords ceased to function mid-plea. The man's eyes bulged and then dulled. It was a small performance of power, consummate and private. In the archive corridors, with their data tube banks and low hum of cooling fans, he found an administrative cluster trying to reroute comms. He took the doors quietly, slipped past confused staff, and harvested raw intel. Memos that named teams, manifest logs that would later shame the council. A junior archivist tried to hit an emergency alert and pulled a panel with hands that shook. Baparaket watched the man's hands, found the right angle, and broke his wrist with a quiet snap. The man never broadcast the alert. He left the body slumped by the console. It was more useful that way. People delayed, people misinformed, people late. Close quarters kills multiplied. A maintenance bot misdirected into a press. A cook in a galley whose hooded door had been jammed shut and whose air was replaced with a gas he had chosen for quick, paralyzing effect. A courier, frantic and varnished with fear, ran the length of a corridor only to find his shuttle bay sealed. When he banged, a concealed filament caught his throat. In the mess halls he walked and watched the ripple when someone dropped dead without warning, food carts overturned, trays smashed, people trampling one another to egress. He noted how quickly chain reactions of panic turned ordinary corridors into slaughter funnels that needed no direct interference from him. Even amid the carnage he moved with the practiced detachment of a man running a controlled experiment. He listened to the scramble of voices, calls for backup, fragments of pleas for mercy, threats barked into static, and he sometimes answered for sport, a hijacked announcement channel playing a child's lullaby one corridor over while guards swarmed into an engineering trap. The lullaby's innocence sharpened panic into confusion. He watched their faces writhe and recorded how that particular emotional blend made soldiers drop their guard. When the initial wave ended, when the corridors were lined with smoking machinery and the slick of blood and oil glistened under panels, he stood at the threshold of the station's inner ring. He had disabled turret arrays, rerouted sensor loops, and taken down half a squad that had thought themselves unstoppable. The station's protocols had failed in layers, and the humans inside were unraveling like frayed ropes. He catalogued the failures and the way fear made competent men become clumsy and predictable. He collected dead guards' keys and a handful of encrypted comm chips like trophies, storing them for later perusal. Beyond the ring lay the deeper sectors, command archives, strategic decks, leadership corridors. He smiled, small and private, as if tasting the last note of an excellent meal. He moved forward, not triumphant, too cool for that, but certain. The initial defenses were meet now, the architecture was exposed. Panic hummed just beneath the surface like an insect chorus. He had made his opening. The real performance was only beginning. He left the initial wreckage as a wake and let the station rebuild in frantic hands that did not know where to look. Chaos breeds error, and he would not be the one to correct it. He injected messages and theater into the system to deepen the psychological toll. Blood-smeared terminals left in the path of patrols, shredded insignia placed to demoralize, and doctored logs implying betrayal among commanders. Those acts were small but poisonous. Paranoia spread like mold in the humid cavities of fear. He staged images across internal feeds, shards of faces from the dead, static-laced taunts that made the council think traitors walked their hallways. He took a moment to watch a command deck disintegrate into accusations. Officers hurling blame, mid-level analysts screaming that their evidence had been corrupted, and an intelligence lead slapping at hollow maps that refused to respond. From a shadowed vent he left a note for the chief. A single line in the log with his signature embedded like acid, "You let the world burn." The chief found it later with shaking fingers. It was a moment he enjoyed savoring. He pushed deeper into the station's veins. Administrative sanctums, intelligence vaults, and the nerve rooms where strategy was born. Each sector had its own tone. The administrative wing smelled of dry paper and coffee oil. The intelligence vaults tasted cold and electronic. Command rooms carried the spicy scent of fear and overwork. He hacked door locks with the tenderness of a man undoing ties and watched the screen blink a false green as seals opened to him. The traps became more personalized the closer he approached the inner circle. He sent tailored messages to specific officers, baiting pride or fear. A logistics overseer who boasted about saving his family's seat in a displacement queue was lured into a maintenance shaft by a falsified family distress call. The lift fell, and the man died in a tangle of cable and brittle bone. He wrote the man's last words down mentally, a quiet memento. A diplomatic liaison, robust and loud in public, found his private quarters rewired to flood with incapacitating gas. No witnesses, no scramble, a slow suffocation in the place where he expected safety. He enjoyed the private cruelty, people dying in their sanctuaries because he chose them to. He used environmental hazards like scalpel edges. A pressurized air duct opened at exactly the wrong second and sent scalding steam tore through a tactical briefing, searing throats and dropping men mid-instruction. A reactor coolant bypass he reprogrammed overflowed, sending a sheet of supercooled liquid across a corridor. An armored hunter slipped, pipe breaking his neck as his spine met steel at a precise angle. Alarms became notes in a composition. Each triggered sensor he'd tampered with created a cascade of faulty human decisions. He watched as protocol manuals were ignored in favor of gut reaction, exactly what he wanted. He often preferred dialogue to spectacle. When a high-ranking administrator called for a ceasefire and offered a ransom of data, he answered through her comm feed in a voice that sounded like her own mentor. "You are compromised. Trust no one." The following hour produced more self-purges and paranoia than any tactical strike. Men turned on men, looking for saboteurs who didn't exist. He leaned back and listened to the sound of organizational rot. His killings in these inner sectors were intimate. A senior analyst who'd once overseen forensics and who insisted on scientific rigor died at a desk, his head bluntly fractured when the chair behind his workstation collapsed because a support bracket had been undermined. The man's last reflex was to swipe at his console. He never did transmit the data he'd been cupping. Another, an officer who liked to collect trinkets from jealous subordinates, was found with his neck broken near a copy of the ledger he once kept, the ledger missing the last page and a microdart forgotten under a cushion. When elite response teams reached the central stacks, they were met with rooms that betrayed them. Senior staff locked out by their own badges suddenly found doors sealed with the codes they had issued. The panic set in deeper. Men in command huddled behind consoles, each one terrified his neighbor might be the traitor. He loved that sound, the quiet, ugly sound of suspicion in a room full of men trained to trust chain of command. He pressed deeper, and the corridor architecture allowed exquisite cruelty. He booby-trapped an elevator so its cables would shear under a specified weight. When a recon squad crowded the cab, they plummeted 4 decks into a maintenance grate rigged to compress. Later, cleaning teams found an arranged scene. Bodies creased like discarded paper, meant to be photographed and leaked outward to humiliate those who'd failed. He left cameras rolling to catch the faces of men who came to look and found only the stench of death. At an intercom note he paused and played a recorded message he had planted days earlier, the voice of an officer who had betrayed his unit, falsified evidence of treason. The recordings played across command speakers, and the room filled with men who could not reconcile their training with the audio. They clawed for reassurances and found themselves strangled by the illusion of betrayal he'd sown. He watched as they executed a junior lieutenant, beaten for a crime he had not committed, and filed the attendant feeds into a private archive. By the time he reached the threshold of the inner sanctum, the guard presence had been thinned by his traps and the corpses of those who had tried to stand were scattered like broken chess pieces. The final corridors were ringed with mechanisms he could pull and sequences he could trigger. A floor that he'd weakened to fold under pursuit, blinding arcs of electricity awaiting a misstep, and sanctuaries wired to expel atmosphere at need. He lined up contingencies, personalized deaths for each leadership voice he anticipated meeting, visualized how each would fall, whether by a blade, an engineered accident, or the slow hum of a dying airfeed. He paused at the last threshold, hand on the hatch control, and let a long, private smile cross his face. The station was falling in ways he had designed. The leadership would not be spared theatrics. He intended their ends to be as instructive as they were final. He stepped through with the air of a man who had finished composing the prelude and was eager for the overture. He stood before the final security layer, a wall of titanium and energy, humming like a dormant beast. The inner sanctum of HQ loomed ahead. Energy shields that shimmered with a faint, lethal pulse. Laser grids crisscrossing the air like spider webs, automated turrets swiveling on precise algorithms. Every detail fed him data. Every detail was a promise. He smiled, the curve of his mouth small, private, almost imperceptible, as if savoring a feast yet unseen. Sensors blinked and hummed. He tapped his gauntlet, sending microbots slithering into their circuits. Cameras froze mid-frame. Drones hovered inert as though contemplating existential despair. He stepped over the polished titanium floors, the faint vibration of orbital defenses pulsing underfoot, hollow consoles flickering with phantom readings. He catalogued every office, noting names on doors, security rotations, personal quirks. The counselor preferred incense, the tech director relied on automated locks he could bypass in milliseconds, and the general had a predictable late-night walk around the inner perimeter. The possibilities of panic danced in his mind like sparks in a storm. As he moved silently, he saw the first line of elite guards, Cybernetic enforcers, muscle and metal fused in efficient brutality. Adaptive AI combat units whose eyes glowed red, and genetically enhanced soldiers whose reflexes outpaced normal perception. One exo-enforcer barked a challenge, voice modulated and hollow. Baparaket responded before a weapon could fire. Step aside, or the shadows will step for you. The enforcer snarled, advancing mechanically. He dropped the nearest hollow console into a precise angle against the floor. Sparks flew. The enforcer's foot caught a power cable. Electricity arced into his armored leg, convulsing circuits. He screamed, servo motors twitching erratically, and before he could recover, Baparaket's energy blade lanced through the chest plate, vaporizing the central exo-core. A flick of his wrist, a small explosion rigged in a maintenance conduit, sent another guard flying into a wall, limbs bent in unnatural angles. The AI unit froze mid-step when a micro-drone jammed its neural interface, and it dropped like a puppet whose strings were cut. The corridor itself became a weapon. He collapsed a support panel, sending shards of composite metal into pursuing guards. A hydraulic vent he'd sabotaged vented scalding steam into the next junction. One soldier stepped in, his exosuit's cooling system overloaded, vaporizing internal circuits. Baparaket walked among the chaos as though he were merely conducting an orchestra. The guard's panic became his music. He smiled at the small, personalized killings. A communications officer had a habit of running to open consoles to call for backup. He waited, watching her patterns through hacked cameras, and when she sprinted, he rerouted the laser grid to intersect her path. The lasers cut through armor, sinew, and bone in a precise, clean execution. She screamed once. He recorded it in memory, cataloging her reaction, noting hesitation and terror. "Call for help all you want," he murmured to a pursuing pair of guards, voice cold and clear through the comms. "No one will hear you." They froze mid-step as a pressurized maintenance conduit above their heads ruptured, blasting one guard's neural implant through his skull. The second slipped on scalding fluid, falling into an exposed generator bay. Sparks licked through his torso, fusing circuits with flesh. The smell was electric and coppery. Baparaket watched clinically, noting the ripple of panic through the remaining security units. Random kills punctuated his advance. A minor engineer, unlucky in wandering corridors he had mapped, turned a corner into a blast of kinetic energy from a pre-rigged elevator fail-safe. Another technician bent over a maintenance panel was impaled by a dangling conduit swung from his own misstep. A cleaning drone, hijacked to release corrosive foam, sprayed a passing officer, eating through armor and muscle in a slow, sizzling horror. He paused only to note reactions, then moved onward. By the time he reached the central administrative wing, the inner sanctum was already in chaos. Alarms screamed, red and blue lights strobing across shattered hollow consoles. Smoke curled from damaged conduits, sparks fell like lightning in a storm. He had rigged doors to seal behind him, sending pursuing guards into trapped corridors where they were electrocuted, crushed, or shredded by rotating machinery. He left the path lined with corpses, some partially incinerated, others in grotesque contortions from falling debris. A tech director appeared at a corner, shouting orders to an empty corridor, trying desperately to restore control. Baparaket smiled. He pressed a console remotely, rerouting energy flows. The director's personal terminal erupted with electricity, throwing him across the room, where he landed atop a secondary conduit. The sparks ignited oxygen-rich venting. The man screamed as fire raced across the floor. "Efficiency is all you need," Baparaket whispered, stepping over the twitching body. Every kill was tailored. One counselor who had been notorious for arrogance was lured into a hydraulic press chamber. He paused at the doorway to observe the panic in her eyes, savored the rapid heartbeat against her chest plate, and with a simple tap on his wristpad, the press engaged. Metal crushed, bone snapped, armor dented. He catalogued the moment with detached fascination. A guard who tried to intervene was pulled into the machinery's misaligned safety gate and shredded in seconds. He didn't just kill. He manipulated environment, terror, and chaos simultaneously. Corridors were lined with pressure panels rigged to explode when the weight of panic-stricken runners triggered them. Doors would slam shut, trapping small groups, then release bursts of superheated air, forcing even the strongest men to stagger, falter, and die in moments of instinctive mistake. Random hallway patrols were vaporized by misdirected turrets. He triggered a cafeteria ceiling panel to collapse, crushing several staff who had fled in fear. Even as alarms blared, he moved silently through smoke and sparks, hacking drones mid-flight, sending them spinning into walls, impaling their operators, or knocking them into scorched electrical conduits. He whispered to himself occasionally, narrating the spectacle, cataloging reactions as data points. Fear is slow, terror is fast, and panic is a flood. He paused at the central junction where elite guards had tried to regroup. With a touch, he overrode floor conduits, sending an arc of high-voltage electricity across the path. One cybernetic soldier convulsed and fell, his neural implants fused into a useless molten mess. Another lunged for a wall panel, only for it to collapse inward with him trapped beneath. The remaining 2 guards hesitated, unsure which hazard to face, and that hesitation was fatal. A micro-missile drone, redirected from a maintenance bay, took them both apart mid-air. By the time he reached the inner sanctum's secondary hub, dozens lay dead in a mix of vaporized metal, impaled flesh, crushed bone, and high-voltage arcs. The air was thick with smoke, burnt plastic, ozone, and the coppery tang of blood. Yet he moved as if through a museum, noting each death, each misstep, each reaction to fear and chaos. He whispered, almost in amusement, as another officer ran into a corridor. Always straight, never sideways. The ceiling vent he had sabotaged released a torrent of superheated steam. The officer screamed, fell backward, and impaled himself on a jagged metal strut. Baparaket walked past, recording mental notes, moving forward with an unhurried precision that was almost ceremonial. The inner sanctum had become a gallery of panic and death. He paused, looking back, letting the scene imprint itself. Corpses littered corridors, alarms blared futilely, sparks danced across scorched walls, and the faint hum of orbital defenses continued, ignored. The stage was set. Leadership lay beyond this threshold, and he had cleared the opening with brutal, psychotic efficiency. He paused in the flickering light of the inner sanctum, surveying the corpses, sparks, and twisted metal around him. Each kill was a lesson in panic, fear, and physics. He could almost hear the murmurs of the survivors, those who hadn't yet been torn apart by his traps. They huddled in corridors, peeking around smoke-filled corners, unaware that every step, every breath, every heartbeat was being tracked. He started with the counselors. One, fat with arrogance and perfumed in vanity, had barricaded herself in a side office, praying behind a reinforced door. He smiled and whispered into the comm frequency, intercepted through a hacked terminal. "You think you're safe? I can smell your fear. Taste it." Her eyes widened as a ceiling vent overhead hissed, releasing a superheated cloud of gas. When she scrambled to the corner, he redirected a maintenance crane remotely. The claw slammed down, pinning her to the floor, then rotated with surgical precision. Screams echoed as the arm crushed her torso, bones snapping, organs flattening, until she was still. Nearby, a tech director tried desperately to restart the mainframe, fingers flying over hollow keys. He grinned. The terminal sparked, then erupted, sending molten circuitry onto the director's lap. He jumped back, slipping on a slick of molten metal that he'd carefully funneled through broken conduits. He fell onto exposed electrical wiring. Sparks danced across his body, fusing implants to flesh. He convulsed and screamed, flailing until Baparaket's energy blade made short work of him, leaving a charred, twitching heap. Random kills continued like clockwork. A messenger officer had ducked into a hallway to escape. The floor panels beneath him were rigged to collapse. With a simple wrist command, the panels gave way, and the man fell into an exposed machine pit, impaled on jagged hydraulic pistons. Another guard attempted to climb a ladder, unaware that he'd triggered a ceiling vent release. Molten oil from a nearby containment tank rained down, incinerating him before he could reach the top. He wandered through corridors as if strolling through a gallery. He noticed a minor security tech hiding behind a console, peering with wide eyes. With a flick of his wrist, the console sparked, ignited, and collapsed on the man. The tech screamed, trying to push away burning panels, but Baparaket had remotely jammed the emergency doors. Smoke and flame did the rest. He didn't even have to touch him. Environmental chaos was layered and endless. Fire suppression systems that had been sabotaged discharged wrongfully, knocking down anyone who attempted to use them. Energy fields rerouted, electrocuting the first unlucky personnel who entered their zones. Water conduits ruptured, sending high-pressure streams of scalding water across the corridors, sweeping guards off their feet into makeshift grinders and exposed vents. "Keep moving," he murmured to no one. Yet every step, every panic-stricken dash by survivors played like a symphony before him. Hesitate, and it will be over faster. A group of 3 elite guards tried to flank him. He sent a maintenance drone swinging from a ceiling cable. It struck the first, tearing off a cybernetic arm. The second tried to pull his partner from the wreckage, only for the swinging drone to rip through his leg. The last one hesitated, and Baparaket lobbed a micro-grenade into the small group, the concussive blast leaving nothing recognizable behind. Every kill was personalized, grotesque, inventive. He noticed a general attempting to access the command console in the central chamber. The conduit beneath it had been rigged with a kinetic amplifier. As soon as the general touched the terminal, it triggered. The floor collapsed. The general plummeted into the machinery below, metal blades spinning, cutting and crushing, sparks and blood splattering the walls. He whispered, almost reverently, "Efficiency perfected." Random personnel weren't spared. A minor secretary, trapped in a hallway by closing doors, froze when he appeared at the end. A quick flash of the energy blade and she was gone. A lone maintenance worker stumbled into a corridor, stepping on an improvised panel that released a high-voltage arc. His body twitched, hair smoking, until another micro-drone delivered the final cut. He paused at an intersection, listening to the alarmed shouts and screams reverberating down the corridors. The inner sanctum had become a living trap, a maze of death where panic dictated outcomes. He initiated a series of delayed hazards, gas vents releasing incapacitating yet lethal fumes, kinetic panels set to slam doors on anyone who tried to escape, micro-drones rigged with explosive payloads patrolling the airspace. Each element of chaos was catalogued, analyzed, and improved in real time. A surviving officer stumbled upon a hacked surveillance terminal, hoping to call for help. He stepped into a hallway where the floor had been deliberately weakened. A trapdoor snapped open beneath him, dropping him into an exposed maintenance shaft with spinning gears. His screams echoed as Baparaket moved past, noting the timbre, the cadence, and the brief flare of fear before death. Even in the main atrium, where the council had once convened, he left signs of terror. Automated turrets he'd hacked pivoted toward surviving staff, shooting precision bursts. Energy conduits overhead exploded in arcs, scorching anyone who tried to move toward the exits. Smoke filled every chamber, hiding his movements and amplifying panic. Dialogue continued sporadically, his voice a low, cold instrument of fear. "Look at your walls. Look at your friends. All gone. Only your fear remains." When a commander attempted a retaliatory strike with a stored plasma rifle, Baparaket disarmed him mid-shot, sending the rifle spinning into a plasma conduit. The rifle discharged accidentally, vaporizing both the commander and a nearby aide. He smiled faintly, stepping over the remnants. Every exit was booby-trapped. Guards attempting to flee were funneled into corridors where gas, fire, electricity, and spinning machinery intersected in calculated, lethal combinations. He watched as panic-ridden survivors made split-second decisions that invariably led to death, stepping into molten oil, triggering electrified floor panels, or running into collapsing ceiling vents. By the time he reached the leadership chambers, the inner sanctum was nearly unrecognizable. Fires burned across corridors, hollow displays shattered, alarms blared uselessly, and the structural integrity of sections was compromised. He paused at the threshold, observing the scene. Dozens of random kills had occurred, each personalized, each precise. Even the most hardened cybernetic guards had fallen. With a final sweep, he eliminated the remaining leadership. A counselor who had survived the previous chaos tried to barricade himself in the command room. A hydro conduit burst into flames, incinerating the threshold. Another leader attempted to access the orbital defense override. A micro-drone fired a projectile through the console, impaling him into the floor. Plasma conduits were redirected into remaining pockets of personnel, vaporizing any resistance instantly. He stood amid the devastation. The inner sanctum had become a tomb of chaos, screams echoing in the smoldering corridors. Smoke, fire, and sparks filled the air, mingling with the copper scent of blood and scorched metal. There was no one left alive to oppose him. "Perfect," he whispered, voice barely audible over the destruction. "No witnesses, no survivors, only control." Every kill, random or deliberate, had been recorded mentally, catalogued for analysis, and executed with psychotic precision. The inner sanctum was his. HQ had been decimated from the inside. Fires burned through the structural ribs, alarms, useless, blared across empty halls. Even orbital defenses remained indifferent to the chaos below. He walked slowly through the atrium one last time, noting scorch marks, corpses twisted in impossible positions, sparks from broken conduits dancing like fireflies in the dark. He moved without haste, savoring the absolute power, the total control, the psychotic clarity that came from being the only living entity in a chamber of death and ruin. Every doorway, every corridor, every shattered console had been part of his symphony of destruction. The inner sanctum lay in ruins, the leadership eliminated, and the survivors either dead or incapacitated. His psychopathy was intact, fully realized, and thriving. HQ's final defenses had crumbled, and he was already anticipating the next phase. Baparaket's shuttle skimmed low across Erythra's orbital lanes, merging effortlessly with the civilian traffic. From above, the command core sprawled like a fortress of steel and energy, turrets bristling along every perimeter, orbital weapons and sensor arrays humming in quiet readiness. The planetary surface was bathed in the pale glow of reactor cores, corridors of titanium glinting as patrols moved methodically, unaware of the storm about to strike. He deployed a swarm of micro-drones, each the size of a fist, to infiltrate the core's security systems. Cameras displayed false corridors, sensors reported phantom patrols, and automated turrets twitched nervously toward empty space. Baparaket crouched in the shuttle's landing bay, boots silent on the titanium floor. He had memorized the patrol rotations, the blind spots, the timing of security. Doors, even the casual routines of clerks and maintenance staff. Everything is catalogued, every error exploited. A squad of cybernetic enforcers rounded the corner, their optics scanning the floor. Baparaket's pulse blade shimmered in his hand. With a flick, the first guard's servos seized, sparks arcing as his body convulsed. The second tripped over debris Baparaket had manipulated moments before. A microbolt fried his implant and he collapsed, twitching violently. The third barely reacted before a plasma dart pierced his chest, the hiss of escaping air blending with the alarms. "Timing is everything," Baparaket murmured, stepping over the bodies as if walking through dust. A janitorial drone hummed past, oblivious. A flick of a hand sent an EMP pulse. The drone spasmed and collapsed. A maintenance worker peeked around a doorframe, curiosity etched across his face. Baparaket smiled, whispering, "Curiosity killed the cat," as a dart pierced the man's neck, killing him instantly. Through a side corridor, a trio of guards debated strategy. Baparaket's concussive mind detonated beneath their feet, sending one crashing into a wall, sparks showering from severed cables. Another stumbled into a hacked conduit. Electricity tore through his exosuit, vaporizing him. The last froze as the ceiling above began to collapse. Baparaket flicked a magnetic trigger, and he was pinned by steel beams. "Predictable," he murmured, moving on. In a comms hub, 3 officers tried to organize a defense. "Stop him. Seal the doors," one yelled. Baparaket activated a plasma pulse, sending the first officer into a live terminal. The second was thrown into a high-voltage panel. The third ducked into a collapsed floor trap. Sparks rained around him as he whispered, "Cute. Truly cute." He moved methodically, herding surviving personnel unknowingly into trap zones. Civilians caught in crossfire were vaporized by plasma bursts or crushed by falling debris. In the maintenance tunnels, 2 engineers argued over machinery. A remote blast sent them into a pit of exposed conduits. One cyber hound staggered from a manipulated polarity field, crashing into a wall and sparking violently. "Science is beautiful," Baparaket whispered, cataloging every reaction. Around a corner, a low-ranking officer aimed a weapon. A micro-grenade sent a shockwave. The officer convulsed, thrown against a panel. Baparaket flicked the switch on an overhead conduit, and a second officer's suit overloaded. Sparks arced across the hall. In the chaos, dozens more fell: clerks, wandering maintenance staff, errant drones, all part of the trail of carnage he left behind. At a junction, elite inner circle guards gathered. "You can't possibly survive this," one shouted, weapon raised. Baparaket smiled, voice soft, almost conversational. "I already have. And now, your chaos begins." He triggered ceiling panels, electrified conduits, and magnetic fields simultaneously. One guard was impaled by falling rebar. Another convulsed from electrocution. The third was crushed under debris. A dying guard gasped, "You can't." Baparaket leaned close, whispering, "Try not to panic next time." He paused briefly, surveying the growing carnage. Sparks danced across floors, smoke coiled along ceilings, alarms screamed in fractured tones. Random kills stacked in corridors, offices, and side halls. 3 clerks caught by plasma traps, a maintenance bot ripped in half by a collapsing catwalk, a wandering trainee electrocuted by a hacked terminal. Each death observed, catalogued, and mentally scored for psychological impact. Further along, 2 junior officers tried to coordinate a counterattack. Baparaket activated a secondary plasma net. Both were caught, one screaming as implants fried, the other impaled on a rogue support beam. Nearby, 3 clerks froze. He triggered a secondary pit of live cables, sending them screaming to a violent, spark-filled death. "The lesson is simple," he whispered. Down the reactor corridor, elite guards blocked his path. Gravity dampeners sent debris cascading onto one. The second's shield was disabled by a hacked panel. Baparaket impaled him cleanly, sparks and fire dancing across the hall. By now, dozens had fallen: guards, clerks, trainees, maintenance bots, and wandering civilians. Each kill observed, every panic catalogued, traps layered perfectly. He hacked a surveillance hub, rerouting oxygen and overloading lights, blinding remaining defenders. Dozens more died. Guards crushed, electrocuted, vaporized, or incinerated by environmental manipulations. He spoke softly to the empty corridors. "I've arrived. The rest of you will know exactly why." 2 junior intelligence officers attempted negotiation. "Please, Baparaket, it's not too late. Stand down," one said, weapon trembling. Baparaket tilted his head, voice cold. "Too late? Perhaps. Enjoyable? Absolutely." Pulse darts pierced their chests. High-voltage conduits finished the rest. By the time he reached reinforced command doors, the inner sanctum was a graveyard. Charred corpses, molten conduits, sparks, smoke, alarms shrieking. Baparaket's psychopathy was fully on display. Each death catalogued, every panic logged, traps layered to perfection. He paused, speaking to the shadows. "I've arrived. And now, the real fun begins." Across the halls, sparks danced as he triggered further remote traps. Security drones malfunctioned and crashed into walls, exploding on impact. Patrols attempting to regroup were funneled into plasma traps or falling ceilings. A group of clerks ran for the cafeteria. Baparaket redirected a hydraulic press, crushing them instantly. A maintenance worker hid in a supply closet. Baparaket's wrist drone found him, firing plasma darts through the panel, ending him silently. In the communication hub, 3 officers desperately typed override codes. "We can't let him reach the core," one shouted. Baparaket smiled, tossing a micro-grenade. 1 officer vaporized, the second impaled on a falling server rack, the third electrocuted against the console. "Predictable," he muttered, leaving behind chaos. Down another corridor, a janitorial squad attempted to contain the damage. Baparaket detonated a concussive mine under their feet. Sparks flew, limbs twisted, bodies tossed into exposed electrical conduits. Nearby, a security drone attempted to fire. Baparaket hacked its targeting, redirecting the beam into a reinforced wall. The drone exploded in a shower of metal and sparks. He reached the final hall before the command doors, environmental hazards rigged, traps layered. A pair of elite guards attempted to flank him. Magnetic fields reversed. Conduits overloaded. Debris and plasma arcs pinned them to the floor as Baparaket walked past, boots silent. His eyes flicked across the control panels, seeing every data node, every reactor conduit, every potential hazard. He whispered to the empty corridors, as if addressing the dead, every reaction catalogued. Every panic observed. You'll rebuild eventually, not today. The command center, now a graveyard of sparks, smoke, and bodies, was his to dominate. Every random kill, every calculated death, every terrified reaction logged in his mind. He was untouchable, unstoppable, fully psychopathic. Baparaket paused, surveying the destruction, whispering to himself, "Let them send more. I've only just begun." Baparaket pressed forward into the heart of the command core, the reinforced blast doors slamming shut behind him with a reverberating echo that shook the steel floors beneath. Sparks from ruptured energy conduits painted the walls in streaks of white and gold, while cooling systems hissed under strain, releasing clouds of scalding steam. The hum of orbital weapons and reactor cores vibrated through the floors, mixing with the distant, panicked shouts of defenders. "Cover the exits, hold the line," yelled a cybernetic officer, his voice tight with desperation. Baparaket merely smiled, the corner of his mouth twitching as he surveyed the scene. "Line?" he whispered to himself, stepping lightly over a twisted bulkhead. One soldier made the mistake of aiming at him, firing a short burst from a plasma rifle. Sparks danced across the air as Baparaket flipped sideways, sliding past the blast. A flick of his wrist and a nearby energy conduit arced violently. The bolt struck the soldier mid-step, frying his implants and sending him collapsing into a molten spill below. Another unit rushed forward, their energy shields flaring. "Take him down, now," one screamed. Baparaket threw a micro-drone into the air. It buzzed like a mechanical hornet before releasing a precise, superheated projectile. The first man's legs melted away, the second's chest cavity scorched in a burst of white-hot plasma. "Too slow," Baparaket murmured, stepping over the remains and tapping a control on his wrist console. An elite hybrid hunter, an amalgam of cybernetic enhancements and alien musculature, charged at him through the chaos. "You won't leave this room alive," it hissed, thrusters flaring. Baparaket ducked under its strike, planting a pulse charge against a nearby cooling conduit. The explosion erupted mid-air, vaporizing the hunter and spraying molten fragments across the corridor. "And that's just the appetizer," he muttered, glancing at the next group trying to flank him. A pair of command officers attempted to escape into an elevator shaft. Baparaket's fingers danced over his wrist console. The doors whined and locked. A sudden surge of energy pulsed through the shaft, vaporizing one officer instantly. The second screamed, pressing against the steel walls, but he too was electrocuted by a redirected power conduit. Sparks and smoke filled the chamber as Baparaket stepped through, observing the carnage clinically. Nearby, a tech specialist scrambled to restore a communications array. "We can reroute power, maybe trap him," she yelled, hoping to coordinate a counterattack. Baparaket's micro-drone swerved overhead, dropping a miniature EMP charge that fused the array and sent an electric pulse down the hallway. The specialist convulsed violently as her cybernetic interface overloaded, melting her faceplate and leaving her body a smoking ruin. "Fascinating," Baparaket murmured, noting her exact reaction to the overload. A cluster of orbital defense engineers rushed into a service corridor, attempting to activate backup turrets. "Don't let him," one shouted before Baparaket flicked his wrist again. Magnetic pulses activated, pulling exposed metal support beams from the walls. The beams skewered 3 engineers, 2 more thrown backward into molten coolant, and another hurled into a plasma vent. Sparks shot out like fireworks as Baparaket walked past, observing each death like a scientist recording results. Even minor, incidental figures were not spared. Maintenance bots scuttled across damaged floors, their joints fused by energy surges or torn apart by debris as Baparaket rigged the environment around them. One bot attempted to warn a nearby officer but was shredded mid-stride by a spinning conveyor panel Baparaket had reactivated. The officer screamed, attempting to flee, only to fall into a molten trap he had set moments earlier. Each kill, each scream, was catalogued in meticulous detail, noted with the same detached curiosity as a chess master recording moves. A group of survivors tried barricading themselves behind a partially collapsed holoconsole array. He's insane. Fall back," one cried, but Baparaket had already tampered with the structural supports above. A thunderous crash sent debris raining down, crushing two and pinning a third beneath a twisted beam. Sparks from exposed conduits set off a chain reaction, frying the remaining defenders' implants in seconds. Baparaket stepped over the wreckage, smiling faintly. So many possibilities, so many errors, he whispered. Across the command core, several hybrid AI mercenaries arrived, hoping to flank him. Sector cleared? Move forward. One emitted in a metallic monotone. Baparaket tapped a sequence on his wrist console, redirecting gravity fields in the chamber. The mercenaries were hurled into walls and energy conduits, their limbs torn apart or incinerated by sparks and plasma arcs. Timing is everything, Baparaket murmured, watching their bodies convulse and fall, eyes glittering with cold amusement. He paused near a strategic control node, where a squad of defenders was attempting to reroute power to shields. Hold them, don't let him. A commander's sentence ended abruptly as Baparaket activated a sequence that caused the floor beneath them to buckle. One soldier fell screaming into a molten flow, another impaled on exposed rebar, two more electrocuted by surge conduits. The commander himself tried to escape via a maintenance hatch, but it collapsed beneath him, leaving nothing but a scream and twisted steel. Nearby, random civilians caught in the chaos tried to escape. A small group ran down a hallway, tripping over debris. Baparaket flicked a console. The ventilation system released scalding steam. One man's head popped through the steam, shrieking, before being thrown by the force into a plasma conduit. Another child, crying, ran blindly into a collapsing wall rigged by Baparaket. Dust, sparks, and molten metal consumed the small figure instantly. Baparaket noted the exact sequence of panic, analyzing reactions with precision. Further down, a squad of command elite attempted to coordinate a counterattack from a rear control chamber. He can't possibly, one began, but Baparaket's drones disabled the chamber's energy shielding, exposing them to plasma conduits. Two officers were vaporized instantly, another was impaled by jagged debris, and the last fled in terror, only to be sliced by a spinning maintenance drone set in a kill pattern moments earlier. Always a step ahead, he whispered, stepping over their remains. An orbital maintenance crew arrived, attempting to use micro-shuttles to evacuate command personnel. Baparaket tapped a sequence on his console, releasing electromagnetic pulses that disabled their engines mid-lift. The shuttles spiraled out of control, crashing into the command core's structure, detonating with flames that spread through adjacent halls. Those inside were vaporized. Scattered debris impaled additional personnel below. Baparaket stepped past, flicking his wrist as if to check the time. Efficiency is exquisite. Even minor environmental elements were weaponized. Leaking coolant created ice-like patches on the floor, causing soldiers to slip into molten conduits. Exposed power lines electrified debris, turning it into lethal projectiles. A lone security officer tried to shield himself behind a console. Sparks jumped across his armor, electrocuting him mid-movement. Another attempted to crawl through a maintenance duct, only to encounter one of Baparaket's drones, which punctured the duct with surgical precision. The final wave of defenders, desperate and terrified, attempted to retreat to the central command chamber. "Hold the core," one shouted, though his voice quavered with fear. Baparaket, standing at a high vantage point, unleashed a precise sequence. Gravity manipulations, plasma conduit overloads, and strategically triggered ceiling collapses. Soldiers screamed as walls buckled, floors ruptured, and molten flows engulfed their escape paths. One man, pinned beneath a fallen console, attempted to crawl forward. A targeted energy pulse ended his struggle instantly. Baparaket descended to the chamber itself. Hollow consoles flickered and melted in the heat, sparks arced across destroyed floors, and the remaining defenders flinched at every step. "This is the end," he whispered calmly, each word deliberate. One officer raised a weapon in defiance. Baparaket tilted his head, tapped his wrist, and the floor beneath the officer collapsed into molten conduits. His scream was cut off as he was consumed instantly. Two more officers attempted to retreat, only to be vaporized by plasma arcs from overloaded nodes. Finally, the central command core was Baparaket's alone. Fires raged across the chamber, molten metal flowed unchecked, alarms shrieked in futile panic, and debris littered the floors. Any remaining personnel had either perished or were incapacitated. He surveyed the destruction, eyes cold, voice barely above a whisper. Absolute. Complete. Perfect. He catalogued every kill, every error, every scream, as if recording the final ledger of chaos. Baparaket's psychopathy was on full display. Not a single death incidental, not a single corner of the command core unmanipulated. Every environmental hazard, every system failure, every remaining defender had been orchestrated, executed, and recorded. The command core, HQ's final bastion, had fallen to him. Fires licked the ceilings, plasma arcs sparked violently, and molten metal flowed like a river across the ruined floor. He stepped through the devastation, untouched, unstoppable, the ultimate predator. Every last elite hunter, cybernetic soldier, and HQ officer lay dead or incapacitated. The command core was obliterated, the organizational hierarchy shattered. The galaxy itself could feel the echo of his triumph, a symphony of calculated destruction. Baparaket paused for a moment amid the ruin, inhaling the acrid smoke and watching sparks dance across flickering conduits. "It is done," he whispered. "They're gone, all of them." And with that, he turned toward the exit, already plotting the next engagement, leaving behind the command core as a monument to his psychopathy, efficiency, and unmatched lethality. Baparaket stood atop the shattered remains of the orbital platform, high above Erythra, the once gleaming jewel of HQ's control, now reduced to smoking craters, twisted metal, and rivers of molten conduits. From this vantage, he could see entire city sectors leveled, their streets littered with bodies, both human and synthetic. Fires consumed energy conduits that had once powered the most advanced security networks in the sector, now erupting into plasma jets that licked the sky. Orbital traffic, civilian and military alike, spun chaotically in the upper atmosphere, colliding with debris from shattered satellites and blown-out shuttles. He watched without blinking, his gaze clinical, cataloging each broken structure and the scattered remnants of defenders and civilians alike. A surviving patrol drone drifted too close to a molten conduit leaking plasma from the destroyed HQ. Baparaket flicked a wrist, sending a micromagnetic pulse. The drone's servos seized. Sparks flew from its circuits as it plummeted to the surface, incinerating anyone unfortunate enough to be in the debris field below. A pair of stray commandos were scouting a ruin. Baparaket activated a collapsed catwalk above them. "Up you go," he murmured. They were pinned beneath falling beams, their screams drowned by cascading fires and molten metal. "Fools," he whispered to the empty sky. Another squad of maintenance bots had wandered into a corridor flooded with molten slag from the remains of a breached energy vat. Baparaket triggered the secondary heat field. The bots melted instantly, sending shards of molten metal skittering into a nearby fuel conduit. The fuel ignited, creating a rolling fireball that incinerated several nearby drones, scattering the remainder of a trapped technician squad into panicked, screaming chaos. A convoy of scavengers attempted to recover salvage from the ruins. Baparaket's wrist drone fired silently from a high ledge, piercing 3 of the scavengers' suits in succession. One spun in the air, colliding with a plasma barrier. Sparks and flame enveloped him. Another tripped into a collapsing scaffold, falling 10 stories into a pit of molten conduits. "I do love it when they move predictably," Baparaket whispered, stepping past the scorched remains of a 4th scavenger who had fled too close to an active energy node. The cries of survivors were a symphony of panic. From a high ridge, Baparaket watched a group of corporate guards attempt to form a defensive perimeter near a half-collapsed bridge. He tapped into the bridge's power grid, sending a pulse through the support struts. Screaming, 2 guards were thrown into a burning data vault, while the remaining 3 were pinned beneath the warped metal. "Nice work," he said aloud, as if praising a performer in a theater. He descended onto the surface with a controlled glide, landing in the midst of debris and dust. Immediately, he spotted a group of fleeing engineers, weaving between broken walls and smoldering conduits. "Too slow," Baparaket muttered. A micro-grenade rolled under their feet. The first engineer's legs were obliterated, the second was thrown against a plasma vent and vaporized, and the third tried to leap over a conduit, only to be skewered by a fallen support beam. Baparaket's attention flicked to a plaza where remnants of HQ forces attempted to regroup. He activated a series of remote trip mines along the perimeter. Soldiers ran blindly, panic blinding them to the danger. One was thrown into a molten slag pit, another impaled on twisted rebar, yet another was electrocuted by a live conduit that Baparaket had rigged moments earlier. "Oh, the panic is exquisite," he whispered, surveying the deaths. Nearby, a group of fleeing civilians ran into a collapsed overpass. Baparaket activated a magnetic pulse on the support beams. Metal screeched and twisted, crushing several beneath it. Two others screamed as falling holographic panels struck their heads. The remainder fled into corridors of chaos, where rigged conduits and molten pipelines awaited. He catalogued their movements, noting how fear directed them like puppets, yet he remained clinically detached from their suffering. A lone scout drone buzzed too close to his position. Baparaket raised a hand, sending a magnetic bolt through its circuits. It spiraled into the air, crashing into a nearby fuel vat. The resulting fireball engulfed a patrol of 5 HQ stragglers, vaporizing them before they could even react. He crouched beside the smoking remains of a civilian transport shuttle, eyes cold as he watched the bodies twist in the heat. He moved silently through the streets, stepping over the mangled corpses of those who had tried to flee. A small squad of robotic sentries moved into view, unaware of the rigged explosive mines beneath their feet. With a tap on his wrist console, the mines detonated. Sparks, metal, and fire erupted. 3 robots were reduced to molten slag. 2 others were impaled by fragments of debris thrown by the blast. A passerby technician had tried to intervene, only to be caught in the debris cascade, screaming as his uniform ignited. "You should have stayed home," Baparaket said softly. A larger patrol appeared around the corner, weapons raised. "Stop him! Kill him!" one shouted, but Baparaket was already several meters ahead, invisible to their sensors thanks to his cloaking tech. He activated a series of remotely controlled energy fields. Guards screamed as arcs of plasma seared through the air, impaling 3 instantly. A 4th fell into a conduit, electrocuted and sent spinning across the ground. 2 more were vaporized by redirected reactor output as Baparaket stepped over the wreckage, smiling faintly. The chaos was a constant wave of destruction. An automated repair drone tried to intervene, welding arms extended. A flick of Baparaket's hand, and a magnetic pulse sent it crashing into a molten conduit. Sparks showered over the heads of 2 fleeing officers. The drone's arms severed both mid-stride. From above, a micro-drone launched a plasma charge. It vaporized a wandering engineer and knocked a nearby guard into a molten trench. Baparaket whispered to the silence, "The orchestra is complete." A small resistance squad attempted to regroup in a hallway. "Hold your ground," one officer barked, but Baparaket was already inside the corridor. A collapsed ceiling panel cut through 3 of them. The remaining 2 scrambled for cover. He activated a plasma conduit, which hurled one into a wall and electrocuted the other mid-step. Around him, debris smoldered, alarms screamed, and the acrid scent of burnt circuitry filled the air. He moved toward a command relay, noting 3 guards attempting to repair it. "No repairs today," he said quietly. An overhead crane collapsed, pinning one. A plasma line arced into the second. The third attempted to flee, only to be skewered by jagged debris flung from the collapse. A civilian technician peeked from a side hall, only to be vaporized by a stray plasma pulse. Baparaket continued systematically, leaving nothing untouched. Hallways were lined with the corpses of the hasty, the foolish, the unlucky. Sparks flew from exposed energy nodes, smoke curled through broken ceilings, and fire consumed the remains of what had once been HQ's proud command infrastructure. Every random kill added to the tapestry of destruction he observed with cold fascination. In the central plaza, 2 survivors of the initial blast scrambled to assemble weapons. Baparaket tapped a wrist console. A nearby molten conduit erupted, hurling one against a wall. The other was impaled on a twisted support beam. "Timing, timing, timing," he whispered, cataloging their reactions for later mental notes. Around him, the chaos was complete. Orbital debris plummeted into streets, patrols were obliterated, drones fried, and civilians caught in crossfire, leaving a perfect pattern of calculated, psychopathic destruction. Even small, incidental kills were observed. A maintenance bot wandered into a molten slag spill, its joints fusing and frame collapsing. A scavenger tripped into a rigged energy trap. Baparaket ignored the moral calculus entirely. For him, every death was a data point, every scream a note in the symphony of ruin he had composed. As he surveyed the smoldering battlefield from a rooftop, he whispered to himself, "I am Erythra's reckoning. Every system will remember this day." The fires below licked at the sky, smoke coiling upward. Dozens of random kills littered every street and corridor, each one intentional, each one catalogued. He tapped his wrist console, sending a final pulse to a remaining patrol. Sparks and screams answered. Baparaket smiled faintly, cold and detached, stepping back as the ruins stretched endlessly below him. The planet's surface was a graveyard, the orbital chaos uncontained, and the remaining defenders too scattered and terrified to form any cohesive resistance. This is my work. Every death, every panic, every collapse is mine. And yet, he knew the chaos was only beginning. Baparaket descended from the shattered orbital platform, landing lightly amid the smoldering wreckage of HQ's last defensive sector. Smoke spiraled in twisted columns around him. Molten metal hissed in the ruined streets, streaking the night sky with bursts of orange and yellow. The once sterile corridors of HQ's administrative complexes were now jagged ruins. Fire and plasma flickered across broken hollow displays and exposed energy conduits. Every surviving soldier, drone, and maintenance bot moved in fragmented chaos, their reactions slow, panicked, and predictable. "Move faster if you want to survive," Baparaket whispered, his voice low, almost reverent, as he observed a pair of scavenger guards moving through the debris. One stepped too close to a fractured plasma conduit. Sparks shot into his chest, vaporizing him in a sickening hiss. The second guard screamed and turned, only to stumble into a puddle of molten metal flowing from a collapsed energy node. "Predictable," Baparaket murmured, flicking a hand toward a nearby pile of rubble. Another steel beam fell, skewering the guard through the torso. His boots crunched on the scorched streets as he moved, his eyes sweeping over the devastation. Across the plaza, a squad of surviving commandos attempted to regroup. "Hold, form a perimeter," one shouted, though his voice cracked with fear. Baparaket tapped his wrist console. A malfunctioning energy panel exploded overhead, showering the group with sparks. Two were hurled backward into a molten conduit. Another tried to dive behind debris but was impaled by twisted metal. The remaining man collapsed, screaming, as Baparaket's micro-drone fired a precision plasma shot into his chest. Baparaket relished the chaos, stepping lightly between pools of molten slag and collapsing overpasses. He moved past a burned-out shuttle, where 4 civilians had tried to salvage supplies. "Please, don't," one cried, but the plea was cut short as he gestured toward an exposed conduit. Sparks arced across the corridor, igniting the civilians' synthetic clothing. Another panicked man tripped over debris, landing face first in molten metal. "Such delicate little dances," Baparaket muttered, cataloging every scream, every flinch, every desperate attempt at survival. From a distance, he observed a squad of surviving engineers trying to activate a communication array. One of them shouted, "We can stop him. Just help me with this." Baparaket smirked. With a small gesture, he triggered a nearby elevator shaft to collapse. It tumbled downward, crushing one engineer instantly, while the debris showered the remaining 2, pinning one beneath twisted metal and sending the other sliding across the scorched floor into a pool of leaking plasma. "Efficiency," Baparaket murmured, inspecting the carnage as though checking a ledger. Even small drones were not spared. A patrol drone hovered too close to his position, scanning the chaos. Baparaket flicked his hand, activating a magnetic pulse. The drone spun out of control, slamming into a crumbling tower. Sparks rained down, igniting several nearby support bots. Their joints fused in the heat, and they collapsed like puppets with their strings cut. Nearby, a group of fleeing technicians tried to escape through a narrow corridor. He tapped a button on his console. A plasma vent opened overhead, vaporizing one instantly. The other 3 were hurled into exposed energy conduits, electrocuted, and scattered in screaming arcs across the ruinous floor. A small squad of stragglers appeared around a partially collapsed plaza. They were disoriented, unsure of where Baparaket was. He's everywhere, one cried, but it was too late. He activated several remote charge points. Explosions rocked the ground. One man was impaled on twisted rebar, another thrown into molten slag, and a third's cybernetic implants fried mid-scream. The fourth tried to flee into a side corridor, only to encounter a rigged maintenance bot that collapsed onto him, crushing him beneath the fused metal. "Oh, the desperation is intoxicating," Baparaket whispered, stepping lightly over the wreckage. Even civilians caught in the chaos were not spared. A group of trapped refugees scrambled across a scorched street. One child tripped on a bent support beam. Baparaket flicked a wrist console. A metal panel, hanging precariously above them, fell and skewered two adults. The child screamed, running blindly into the heat of molten conduits. A precision plasma shot from Baparaket's drone ended the terror instantly. "And so the lesson continues," he whispered, eyes cold. He moved toward a command relay center, where remaining HQ officers attempted to rally defenses. "Hold your ground," one shouted, but Baparaket was already inside, using his wrist console to manipulate environmental systems. Energy conduits arced to life. A high-voltage pulse shot through the floor, tossing 3 officers into the ceiling. Sparks erupted from consoles. A 4th officer tried to scramble away, only to be skewered by jagged debris from a collapsing wall. The last attempted to flee via a service hatch, which Baparaket had rigged to collapse. He fell screaming into the machinery below. "All accounted for," Baparaket said softly, checking the ledger of chaos in his mind. Outside, orbital debris rained down onto streets and plazas. A patrol squad attempted to take cover beneath a half-collapsed overpass. Baparaket activated a magnetic field, ripping a support beam loose. It skewered one, rolled over a second, and collapsed the overpass entirely. The remaining 2 guards tried to retreat, only to be caught in secondary explosions triggered by the falling debris. Across the streets, stray drones collided with ruined buildings or were impaled on twisted metal poles. Every movement, every death, was catalogued meticulously. He descended into the lower industrial districts, where molten conduits from damaged energy plants flowed unchecked. A group of scavenger soldiers attempted to extract remaining tech. Baparaket activated a heat field, causing molten metal to surge and engulf the first man entirely. 2 others tried to flee into a control bay, which he simultaneously overloaded with electrical arcs. Sparks and screams filled the chamber as their bodies convulsed from the overload. Even maintenance bots were melted into molten slag as collateral. Through the city's main thoroughfare, he watched a convoy of survivors attempting to escape. "Run all you want," he whispered, stepping aside from the heat of a nearby conduit. Micro-drones fired with precision. One soldier's legs were blown off. Another was thrown against a wall and crushed by debris. 2 more fell into exposed plasma vents. A civilian caught in the crossfire screamed, trying to pull a wounded companion to safety, but Baparaket's control of the environment was absolute. A twisted steel support skewered them both. Even the smallest, incidental figures were not overlooked. A lone street sweeper robot wandered into a molten spill, melting almost instantly. A scavenger stumbled into an exposed cable conduit, electrocuted mid-stride. A messenger bot carrying data from a collapsing comm tower was caught in a heat field, vaporized along with its operator. Every random kill was logged mentally by Baparaket, each death a note in the symphony of destruction he had orchestrated across Erythra. He paused atop a scorched roof, observing the entirety of the chaos. Fires burned unchecked, smoke coiled into the sky, molten metal ran through streets, and survivors scrambled futilely. A squad of surviving HQ reinforcements tried to regroup, shouting orders. Baparaket flicked a small switch on his wrist console. A series of plasma conduits along their path ignited. Soldiers were hurled backward, electrocuted, and skewered in rapid succession. One last officer tried to escape into a service hatch rigged to collapse. Baparaket activated the sequence. A deafening crash followed, and the officer's screams were extinguished as he was buried beneath twisted metal and molten debris. With the planet's surface now a vast graveyard, Baparaket ascended back to his orbital perch. He surveyed Erythra, the ruins of HQ sprawling below, orbital traffic scattered and smoldering, and molten flows running like veins across the scorched cities. Fires raged in abandoned buildings, debris fields clogged streets, random, incidental kills dotted every corner, survivors, drones, scavengers, and bots alike. No one remained untouched by his precision, psychopathy, and environmental mastery. "Chaos is beautiful," he whispered, voice low and measured. "Every system, every life, every failure is a brushstroke. I am both artist and executioner." Even from orbit, he could see ripple effects of his destruction. Planetary governments scrambled to respond, fleets rerouted or destroyed, communications blacked out. Rebel factions rose spontaneously. Criminal syndicates attempted to exploit the instability, only to be met with incidental collateral devastation from automated traps he had left across the urban sprawl. Every layer of chaos reinforced the next, as if Erythra itself were reacting to his will. Baparaket checked the final sequences on his wrist console. Incendiary charges across abandoned HQ sectors, remote plasma arcs along major thoroughfares, and micro-drones programmed to intercept any survivor attempting escape from orbital debris zones. Each kill sequence was deliberate, personal, and maximized for terror. In one sweep, a fleeing convoy of scavenger vehicles was ambushed. The explosions hurled the occupants into molten flows, shredded by debris and plasma arcs. No mercy was given, none expected. Finally, he stepped onto his commandeered transport vessel, a sleek, fast craft capable of hyperspace jumps. From the hatch, he surveyed the burning planet below, molten rivers, smoking ruins, and scattered corpses stretching for miles. He was untouchable, unstoppable, and psychopathy intact. His eyes flicked to the hyperspace control, plotting the next trajectory. As the engines hummed and the craft leapt from orbit, Erythra receded behind him, a planet utterly reshaped, obliterated, and scarred by the precision and chaos of Baparaket's hand. "Remember me," he whispered to the void, voice cold and serene, "for chaos is eternal, and I am its architect." He vanished into the void of hyperspace, leaving a galaxy in turmoil, systems fractured, and civilizations struggling to survive the aftermath of his unimaginable rampage. Nothing would be repaired, nothing would be restored, and Baparaket's psychopathic dominion continued, unresolved and absolute.
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. To encourage us to make more videos, please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share.